had always wanted to spend some time alone in the woods. I was burnt out from work, tired of staring at screens, and just needed a break. I booked a remote cabin in a quiet part of Montana. It wasn't a fancy vacation rental or anything, just a small, basic wooden cabin I found listed on a website that offered off-the-grid stays. No electricity, no running water, no cell signal. That was the appeal. A place where I wouldn't hear a phone ring or be bothered by emails. I thought I needed silence, and I thought I needed nature. I was wrong. The place was a 4-hour drive from the airport, and the last part of the road was just dirt. I had to slow down to avoid potholes and thick patches of mud. On both sides of the road were thick trees, tall pines with dark, rough bark, and huge mossy rocks that looked like they hadn't moved in centuries. The deeper I drove into the forest, the quieter everything felt. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was more like the kind of quiet where even the birds are careful not to make noise. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. A one-room structure with a steep tin roof, a single door, and 2 windows, one on the front and one on the side. The cabin stood in a small clearing, about 20 feet from the tree line. Behind it was a thick stretch of forest. In front of it was a wide, empty field that sloped slightly downward and stretched out for maybe 2 football fields. At the far end of the field, the trees started again. Beyond those trees, I didn't know what was there. I unloaded the supplies from the back of the car. I had canned food, a cooler full of ice packs and simple groceries, bottled water, a small camping stove, flashlight, extra batteries, and a few books. I also had a heavy-duty knife and a bear spray canister just in case. I didn't bring a gun. I didn't grow up with them and didn't think I'd need one. That would end up being a mistake. Inside, the cabin was simple. One small wooden table and chair near the front window. A cot with a thin mattress pushed against the wall. A small wood stove with a stack of chopped logs beside it. A few shelves with old cookware and jars of nails, matches, and other leftover stuff. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin near the trees. The first night was uneventful. I lit some candles and boiled water for instant coffee. I read for a few hours and then got into my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the sound of wind moving through the trees. Took a while to fall asleep, but I eventually did. The second day was peaceful too. I walked through the field, picked some wildflowers, took photos of mossy rocks, and watched ants carry leaves back to their mound. I spent some time chopping more firewood even though there was already plenty. I needed something to do with my hands. I started to settle in. By nightfall, I felt tired in a good way. Sore muscles, dirty hands, sun on my neck. I sat by the open front door, watching the sky go dark and the shadows stretch long across the field. I remember thinking I hadn't felt that kind of stillness in years. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was something else, a feeling. I lay still for a few minutes, not moving, just listening. First, I heard nothing. Then I heard something faint, like a crunch. Not a branch breaking, more like someone stepping on dry leaves. I sat up and quietly got out of my sleeping bag. I moved to the window and looked out. The moon was high enough that I could see the field clearly. The grass looked pale silver under the light. At the far end of the field, just at the edge of the woods, I saw something. I squinted. It looked like a person, a man, standing still. I kept staring, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks. But no, he was definitely standing there, not moving, facing my direction. I don't know how long I stared before I finally moved away from the window. I turned off the flashlight, just in case it reflected. I sat on the floor and stayed there for over an hour. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I went back to the window. The man was gone. The next morning, I walked out to the edge of the field to check. I didn't see any footprints, but the grass was tall and dry, so someone could have walked through it without leaving much sign. Still, it bothered me. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest house was miles away, and the road was blocked by a chain gate that I had locked myself. I checked it, still locked. That afternoon, I felt uneasy. I kept looking out the window every few minutes. I didn't go out walking like before. I stayed close to the cabin, even kept the door closed. I kept telling myself it was probably just someone passing through, maybe a hiker or a local hunter. But then why would they stand still and watch the cabin in the middle of the night? The third night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lights off and sat in the dark with my back against the wall and the knife in my lap. I kept glancing at the field. Around 3 a.m., I saw him again. He was in the same spot, just standing, facing the cabin, not moving. This time, I didn't hide. I just stared back. My mouth was dry. My hands were sweating. After about 5 minutes, he turned and slowly walked into the woods. I watched until he disappeared into the shadows. At sunrise, I walked to where he'd been. Again, no clear footprints. No signs of camping gear or trash. Nothing. It was like he had appeared and vanished into thin air. But I knew what I saw was real. I decided I would leave the next morning. That day, I packed my things early. I kept the knife on me at all times. I didn't read. I didn't chop wood. I didn't cook. I just sat inside and waited for the sun to go down. That night, I sat at the table with the flashlight off. I didn't light the candles. I wanted to see out, but I didn't want him to see in. At some point, I must have fallen asleep sitting up. I woke up to a soft sound, metal clinking. It was near the back. I stood up quietly and moved to the side window. I could see the outhouse barely, but nothing else. The sound came again, this time louder, like something tapping on metal. Then I heard it clearly, the doorknob on the back door of the cabin being turned. Slowly, then stopped, then again. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. I picked up the knife and held my breath. The door didn't open. I moved to the front of the cabin, grabbed the flashlight, and quietly unbolted the door. I threw it open and ran straight to the car. I didn't care about the gear. I just had the keys in my pocket and jumped in. The tires kicked up gravel as I backed out and turned down the dirt road. The cabin disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I drove straight through the night back toward the city. I didn't stop for gas until the sun was up and there were other cars and buildings around. Later, I called the property owner and told them someone had been creeping around at night. They said they'd never heard of anything like that before. I didn't care. I told them I wouldn't be coming back and hung up. Weeks later, I still thought about the man. About the way he just stood there like he had all the time in the world. About how he knew exactly where I was. About the way he touched the doorknob like he was trying to decide whether or not to come in. I don't go camping anymore. I don't rent remote cabins. I don't hike alone. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my ears tuned to that kind of quiet where the wind stops and every sound feels like it's too loud. And I remember that man standing out there in the field, and I always wonder if he's still there. I had never stayed alone in a cabin before. I always thought of it as something other people did. People who liked camping, fishing, or chopping wood for fun. I was more of a quiet guy who preferred a structured life in the city. But after a really messy breakup and a lot of stress at work, I needed to get away for a while. So I rented this small cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana through a listing online. It was remote, far from any town, surrounded by tall pines, and had no Wi-Fi or phone service. That was exactly what I wanted. I figured I could just read, sleep, and clear my mind for a few days. The listing showed a one-room wooden cabin with a small porch, one window on the front, a wood-burning stove, a bed, and a table. It had a little outhouse about 30 feet away and a hand pump for water. There were no neighbors, no roads in sight, and the nearest highway was a long, rough drive through dirt trails that cut through thick forest. I got there on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. It was already chilly, and the leaves were just starting to turn orange and red. I parked my truck by the front and unloaded my bags. I brought a lot of food, canned stuff, dried meals, snacks, and a few gallons of water just in case the pump didn't work. I also had a big duffel bag with warm clothes, books, a flashlight, a hatchet, and a small .38 revolver I kept for protection. I had a license for it, but I rarely used it. I just brought it because I'd be alone in the woods. You never know. The first evening went by quietly. I made a small fire in the stove and sat in the chair near the window, reading a paperback novel. The forest outside was completely still. No car sounds, no city noise, just the wind moving gently through the trees. It was the kind of silence that made you feel more alert, like your ears were working harder than usual. Every small crack of a branch or rustle of a bush outside felt louder than it should have. I went to bed early and slept well. The bed was rough but warm, and I was so tired from the drive that I barely moved all night. When I woke up the next morning, I felt more rested than I had in weeks. The second day was peaceful too. I hiked a bit around the woods, marked trees so I wouldn't get lost, and gathered some firewood. I kept to a small area not far from the cabin. The trees grew thick around here, and it didn't take long before everything looked the same in every direction. I wasn't stupid. I knew how easy it was to lose your way out here, so I stuck close. That night, I was sitting on the porch around dusk, watching the sun go down behind the tree line. I had a mug of instant coffee in my hand and a blanket over my lap. It was quiet again, but I noticed something weird. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees, not moving. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but it wasn't. It was definitely a man. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the distance, but his shape was clear. He was standing maybe 50 or 60 feet away, right where the trees started. He wasn't walking, wasn't waving, wasn't calling out. He was just standing there, still as a statue, like he was watching me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was that it was maybe a hiker who had gotten lost, but something felt off. I didn't want to call out because there was no one else around, and I didn't want to give away that I was alone. I stood up slowly and went inside, locking the door behind me. I turned off the light and peeked through the window. He was still there, just standing. After about 10 minutes, I looked again. He was gone. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing small noises outside, twigs snapping, the crunch of leaves, but I told myself it was just animals. I kept the revolver under my pillow and stared at the ceiling for hours. The next morning, I went out and looked around the tree line. I didn't see any footprints or anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was a deer or something and my mind had made it into a man because I was alone and on edge. I tried to enjoy the third day. I cooked some canned stew on the stove, chopped more wood, read more, but I kept glancing at the trees, checking for movement. Nothing. That night, I didn't sit on the porch. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a scraping sound. I grabbed the revolver and stood up slowly, listening. The sound came from outside, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. It moved around the wall slowly from one end to the other. Then it stopped. I didn't turn on the light. I just stood there in the dark, breathing quietly, every hair on my arms standing straight. Then there was a knock, just one. A single knock on the front door. I didn't move. My hand gripped the gun tighter. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes. No more sounds followed. No footsteps, no voices, just that one knock. Eventually, I sat back down on the bed. I stayed up the rest of the night, gun in hand, staring at the door. The next morning, I stepped outside. There were no footprints, no marks, nothing, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That was the last straw. I packed everything and decided I'd leave before nightfall. It didn't matter if I had paid for a week. Something wasn't right, and I didn't feel safe. I loaded my bags back into the truck and checked everything twice. Before I left, I walked once more around the cabin to see if I missed anything, and that's when I found it. Carved into the back of the cabin, in the wood, right below the window. A single word. Soon. It wasn't written with a marker or paint. It was scratched deep into the wood with something sharp, probably a knife. The letters were large, uneven, and fresh. The edges of the cuts still had tiny wooden splinters sticking out. I didn't even lock the door. I got in the truck and left. The dirt trail back to the highway took nearly an hour to drive. It was narrow and full of dips and rocks. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out onto the path, but it stayed empty. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about 40 miles away. I filled up, sat in the parking lot, and tried to calm down. My hands were shaking. I never went back. I reported it to the company that ran the listing. They said no one else had reported anything unusual there. Maybe that's true. Or maybe other people didn't get the chance. Weeks passed, then months. I tried to forget it, but some nights when I was lying in bed in my apartment, I would think about that word carved into the wood. About the man standing in the tree line. About the knock at the door. I still don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he was just watching me or planning something worse. But I know one thing for sure. He was real. And he was close. Too close. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here writing this. I drove up to the cabin in early fall, hoping for some time away from everything. I didn't want noise, I didn't want city traffic, and I didn't want to be around anyone. The stress from work had built up so much over the past 6 months that I started having trouble sleeping and even eating. My blood pressure was high, and I was snapping at people for no reason. I figured I just needed a break somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't have phone reception or loud cars outside or bright lights all night. I found the cabin on a local website that listed private rentals. It wasn't on Airbnb or anything fancy like that, just a simple listing with a couple of pictures. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin on stilts, surrounded by trees. There was no driveway, just a dirt road that led through the woods, and from what I could tell, no other buildings nearby. The price was cheap, and I didn't ask many questions. I wanted to disappear for a while, and this place looked like it would let me. I packed my truck with what I thought I'd need. Mostly canned food, water jugs, some instant coffee, a small propane stove, my sleeping bag, and a few tools just in case something broke. I brought a portable battery bank to charge my phone, but I didn't expect to use it much. I even left my laptop behind on purpose. The drive took longer than I expected because the last few miles were just dirt roads full of potholes and loose gravel. I had to slow down a lot to keep from ruining my suspension. I passed a rusted-out mailbox that had no name on it and figured that was probably the turnoff for the cabin. After another 15 minutes of creeping along a path that barely looked wide enough for a car, I saw it through the trees. It was smaller than it looked in the pictures. A one-room structure, raised a few feet off the ground on concrete blocks. It had a small deck out front and a door that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no lock, just a heavy wooden latch. No lights, no wires, no sign of power. It was quiet, really quiet. The air smelled like damp leaves and would smoke, though I couldn't tell where the smoke smell came from. Maybe it was just stuck in the walls. I parked the truck and left my bags inside it for a minute. I climbed up the 3 steps to the deck and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loud. Inside, there was a simple cot against the wall, a wooden table with 1 chair, and an old cast-iron stove in the corner with a short metal chimney running up through the roof. A few shelves held some dusty canned goods and jars, all way past expiration. There was a metal bucket under a spout, probably for collecting rainwater. No toilet, just an old shovel leaning by the door. I'd have to dig holes if I needed to go. That didn't bother me. I wasn't expecting luxury. I brought in my supplies slowly, organizing them in piles around the room. I put my sleeping bag on the cot and my tools under the table. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the stove and warmed up a can of beans. It wasn't cold enough for a heavy fire, but it helped take the edge off the damp air. I listened to the wind moving through the trees, the soft crackle of the fire, and nothing else. It was the quiet I'd been craving. The first strange thing happened on the second night. It was late, maybe close to midnight. I had been lying on the cot for an hour or more, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something that didn't fit the normal forest sounds. It was a short, sharp crack, like a firecracker popping far away. Then another one. Then silence again. I sat up, listening. A few minutes later, I heard another crack, closer this time. It was a gunshot. I'd heard enough of them in my life to recognize the sound. Someone was shooting out there at night in the woods. I didn't panic, but I got up and turned off the little lantern I had going. I didn't want to be a glowing target in the middle of nowhere. I sat on the floor by the stove and listened for over an hour. The shots didn't continue, just those few. Maybe it was someone hunting illegally at night. Maybe a local guy target shooting. I didn't know. The next day, I found some empty shell casings in the dirt road about 100 yards from the cabin. They looked fresh, brass still shiny, no corrosion. Someone had fired a rifle recently and not too far away. That made me a little uneasy. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was just rural life. People shot guns in the woods all the time, especially in the off-season. But then I started hearing things more regularly. Not just gunshots. Every night for the next 4 days, I heard movement outside the cabin. Branches breaking, footsteps in the underbrush, something brushing against the walls. One night, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing on the other side of the door. I didn't open it. I sat with a knife in my hand and my heart pounding in my ears, too afraid to even make a noise. In the morning, there were no signs. No footprints, no scratch marks, no signs of animals. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. On the 5th night, things got worse. I had just turned in for the night when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I didn't know anyone else even came this way. I got up, turned off my lantern, and looked through the small gap between the boards on the window. Down the hill, maybe 50 feet away, a pair of headlights sat in the trees. Not moving, just parked there. I watched for a long time, trying to make out who it was. The lights stayed on. No doors opened. No one got out. They stayed like that for almost 2 hours. Then, without warning, the engine started again, and the lights moved away slowly until they were gone. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed awake all night, holding my knife and listening. The next morning, I walked down the trail to where the truck had been. I found fresh tire marks and some muddy boot prints, heading off into the woods. Not down the road, but into the trees. I followed them for a while, careful not to get lost, until they vanished over a small rise. Something didn't feel right. Whoever it was hadn't been hiking or sightseeing. The prints were too deliberate, too fresh, like they had been watching the cabin. Later that day, I found something else. Behind the cabin, maybe 20 yards into the woods, I noticed a patch of disturbed earth. It looked like someone had dug there and then filled it back in. The dirt was looser than the rest of the forest floor, and there were scuff marks around it. I didn't want to touch it at first, but after an hour of pacing and debating, I brought my shovel out and started digging. About 2 feet down, I found a black plastic trash bag. Smelled bad. Not rotting meat bad, but like chemicals, strong, harsh chemicals that stung my nose. I opened the bag carefully and found what looked like military gear inside. A pair of used gloves, a balaclava, 2 full magazines of rifle rounds, and a small burner phone with no SIM card. The phone was off, but it had some dirt in the charging port. It had been there a while. I buried it again and didn't tell anyone. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I had just dug into something I wasn't supposed to know about. Something that didn't want to be found. I started planning to leave the next day. I told myself I'd pack everything that night and head out first thing in the morning. But that night, they came back. This time, I didn't hear them until they were close. It was around 1 a.m. I had just started to drift off when I heard a single crunch outside. Then another. This time, more than one set of footsteps. I sat up and didn't make a sound. No lights, no fire, just darkness. Then I saw the beam of a flashlight sweep across the woods outside. Not randomly. It was moving slow, methodical, like someone searching for something. Or someone. They didn't knock. They didn't call out. They just walked slowly around the cabin, boots thudding against the wooden deck. I could hear breathing, heavy, deliberate. I sat perfectly still in the corner, holding my knife with white knuckles. Minutes passed, then more. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the woods again. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I got out. I packed everything fast, barely checked anything. I didn't even eat. I just tossed my gear in the truck and drove like hell down the dirt road. About a mile from the cabin, I passed a sign I hadn't noticed on the way in. It was nailed to a tree and mostly covered in moss. It said, in faded red letters, restricted, training zone, no trespassing. That's when things started to make more sense. I got back to town and looked up the area on some old maps. The land where the cabin stood was right near the edge of an old military training range. one that had supposedly been shut down in the 90s. But I kept digging and I found more. In some forums, people talked about unlisted live-fire drills still being run out there, private contractors using the woods for things that weren't exactly legal. No records, no accountability. I think I saw something I wasn't supposed to, or maybe I was just too close to something I didn't understand. Either way, I never went back. I don't know who those people were. I don't know what they were doing out there, or why there was a hidden cache buried behind the cabin. All I know is I came way too close to finding out, and I was lucky to leave when I did. I had always worked best alone. I was one of those people who could sit for hours in front of a laptop, not moving except to sip cold coffee or stretch my legs for a few minutes. My job didn't require much interaction with anyone. I did data entry for a logistics company, remote work, paid the bills, nothing fancy. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the city, with walls thin enough to hear arguments through and neighbors loud enough to make me wear earplugs almost every night. About 4 months ago, my manager asked if I could take on a large assignment that required a week or so of full focus. It was a backlog of shipment records from a merged company. I agreed, but I knew I wouldn't be able to handle that much work while still surrounded by the noise of city life. I remembered a coworker once mentioning his uncle owned a cabin in the woods, a few hours outside the city, and he occasionally rented it out for cheap. I contacted him, and a few days later, I was packing for a week-long stay at a remote cabin deep in the hills of a forested area in northern Oregon. I loaded up my car with groceries, extra chargers, a portable generator just in case, and everything I thought I'd need to be alone and productive. I didn't expect luxury. I just wanted silence, peace, and enough time to finish what I needed to do. The drive took just under 4 hours. The last 30 minutes were on a gravel road that twisted through thick forest, trees leaning over like they were trying to keep the sky for themselves. I only passed one other vehicle during that time, a pickup heading the opposite way, and didn't think much of it then. The cabin itself sat at the end of a short, steep driveway that led off the main gravel road. It was small, just a single room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, and a twin bed against the wall. There was a basic bathroom with cold running water, powered by a small tank system. No Wi-Fi, but I brought a hotspot device and my laptop had everything downloaded already. Cell service was spotty, but I had a signal if I stood near the front porch. It was perfect. The first 2 days were uneventful. I worked all day and cooked simple meals at night. I walked the woods a little during the afternoons, mostly to stretch and take breaks. The trees were dense, and the air was cool and clean. I didn't see any other cabins or houses around, not even trails. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself. But on the 3rd day, things started to feel strange. It began with something small. I had gone out for a walk just before sunset. I was following a dry creek bed I'd noticed earlier, letting it guide me through the forest. I remember the sound of birds tapering off as the light dimmed, and something about the way the woods felt made me uneasy. There was a stillness that didn't sit right. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, but then I turned around to head back and realized I had wandered farther than I thought. The trees looked different. I couldn't see the creek bed anymore. I panicked for a few minutes, my heart beating faster than I'd felt in a long time. I wasn't lost exactly. I still had a general sense of direction, but I was farther from the cabin than I planned, and it was getting dark fast. I moved quickly, trying to retrace my steps, and finally spotted a familiar stump I remembered passing earlier. I got back just as the sun disappeared behind the trees. I chalked it up to being careless and didn't think more of it until the next morning. When I stepped outside, there were boot prints in the dirt around the porch. Heavy, deep treads, much larger than mine. They weren't there the night before. I was sure of it. I would have seen them when I came back. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the woods behind it. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. I didn't know what to make of it. It was private land. No one was supposed to be out here, but I couldn't deny they were fresh. The soil was still soft from rain 2 days ago, and the prints were clean and sharp. I felt exposed after that, vulnerable, like someone had been watching the cabin, maybe watching me. I kept the door locked, and I stopped going out on walks. I focused on work, pushing myself to finish faster so I could leave sooner. But at night, I had trouble sleeping. Every small noise outside made me sit up and hold my breath. On the 5th night, something hit the cabin wall. It was loud, like a log or a fist slamming against the back wall near the bed. I jumped up, heart pounding, and turned on my flashlight. I didn't see anything through the window. I didn't hear footsteps or movement, just silence after that one solid thud. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting in the chair with a kitchen knife in my hand, which was the only thing I had that could be called a weapon. I kept telling myself maybe it was an animal, a deer, a bear, but bears don't hit walls like that and then leave without making a sound. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of damage. I found a long scrape on the back wall, just below the bedroom window. It looked like something metal had dragged against the wood. Not an animal, not by accident. It was intentional. That's when I knew someone was messing with me. I packed up that morning. I told myself I didn't need to stay the whole week. I'd done most of the work. I was behind on sleep and just wanted to get back to the city. I loaded the car and started to drive down the gravel road. I didn't make it more than a mile. A tree had fallen across the road. Not a small one either. It was thick and heavy, still fresh, the leaves on the branches still green. I got out and tried to move it, but it was impossible. Even if I had tools, I wouldn't have been able to clear it by myself. I stood there in the silence, breathing hard, sweating even though it was cold. My first thought was that it had fallen on its own. But there was something about the way it was positioned, like it had been cut or pushed over intentionally, right where the road narrowed. I looked closer and saw faint marks near the base of the trunk. X marks. Someone had cut it. Not completely, just enough to weaken it so it would fall with a good shove. I backed up, got into the car, and drove back to the cabin. I didn't know what else to do. There was no signal on the road. I thought about walking to try and find help, but I didn't even know which direction the nearest house or town was. I told myself I'd try the hotspot again, maybe send an email or message. I'd seen one bar of signal if I stood on the porch before. It might work. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights off, sat on the bed with the flashlight in my lap, listening. Every sound felt amplified. The wind in the trees, the creak of the wood stove cooling down. I kept thinking about those boot prints, about how close they had come to the cabin, about the scrape on the wall. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement outside. There was a shape, tall, wide shoulders, just barely visible at the tree line. Too far to make out clearly, but close enough to know it wasn't an animal. It just stood there, motionless, watching. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I turned off the flashlight, slowly, and sat in the dark. It stayed there for maybe 10 minutes. Then it was gone. I didn't see where it went. The next morning, I found another scrape, this time on the front door. Long, shallow, and deliberate. I didn't leave the cabin that day. I rationed food, tried the hotspot again, but it wasn't working anymore. I kept my laptop charged with the generator and wrote a long document explaining everything that had happened, saved it on a USB drive, and hid it under a loose floorboard, just in case. That night, I didn't see anything, but I heard something. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving around the porch. Then the sound of the doorknob turning. Soft, careful. I had locked it. I checked it 5 times. Then silence again. I sat in the corner with the knife, stomach in knots, heart thudding in my ears. The footsteps circled the cabin again. I couldn't see who it was. I didn't want to get close to the windows. Eventually, they left. Or maybe they just stopped moving. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would leave on foot. I took only what I needed: my phone, some water, the USB, and a small flashlight. I locked the cabin behind me and started walking east, the direction I thought the main road was. I didn't stop. I didn't take breaks. I just moved. It took hours, but eventually, I heard the distant sound of a car. I reached the main road just as an old man in a delivery truck was driving by. He stopped, stared at me like I was crazy, and let me use his phone. I called the police and told them everything. They sent someone out, but by the time anyone got to the cabin, Whoever had been out there was long gone. They found the downed tree, the scrape marks, even the footprints around the cabin. But there was no way to trace them. No cameras, no witnesses, no answers. I stayed in a motel for 2 days before driving back to the city. I couldn't go home right away, couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that first night, the noise on the wall, the prints, how they kept coming closer each night, like whoever it was had been planning something, playing a game, watching me. I moved out of my apartment 2 weeks later, found a place with more people around. I started locking my door with 2 extra bolts, got a new job that didn't require remote work. I had been planning a break for months. I was working too much, barely sleeping, and always surrounded by people. The pressure in the city was slowly grinding me down. I didn't want anything fancy. I didn't want crowds or beaches or anything expensive. I just wanted to be alone, away from noise, people, and phones. I found a listing online for a small off-grid cabin in the northern woods, deep in a part of the country most people didn't even know existed. It was cheap because it had no electricity, no Wi-Fi, and barely a road going to it. It was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, remote, alone. I packed everything I thought I might need. Cans of food, water jugs, batteries, power bank, matches, sleeping bag, hiking boots, a sharp knife, a basic toolkit, even a small hatchet. I printed the map because I didn't want to depend on my phone. The guy who rented it out had emailed me GPS coordinates and told me to follow the dirt road for about 5 miles after the last paved section. He said the cabin was small but solid, with a wood stove, an outhouse, and a hand pump for water. I was honestly excited. I hadn't felt this calm in weeks. The drive was long and slow. As I got further away from the city, I started feeling better. My head felt clearer. The air smelled clean. I rolled down my windows just to feel it. No sounds of traffic, no sirens, just wind and trees and distant birds. After 6 hours on the highway and another hour on smaller roads, I reached the last turnoff. The paved road ended, and a narrow, bumpy dirt trail began. I drove slowly, tires crunching over rocks and sticks. There were no houses, no mailboxes, no signs, just trees, thick woods on both sides. I didn't pass a single car for miles. Eventually, the trail opened up just enough to reveal the cabin. It was small, one room maybe 20 feet wide, dark wooden logs stacked tight. The roof sloped low on one side. There were 2 windows, both shuttered. A small porch with an old rocking chair that looked like it might collapse if you sat on it. The outhouse was about 30 feet behind the cabin. I could hear a tiny creek running somewhere beyond the trees. The place was old but looked solid. It wasn't falling apart like some places I had seen on forums. It looked like it had been kept up, but not recently. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. There was no sound except the wind in the trees. No voices, no cars, no planes, nothing. Just a gentle hum of wind and leaves. I got out, stretched, and walked around. There were some tracks near the cabin, old tire marks, maybe weeks old. Could have been the owner or the last person who stayed here. Nothing fresh. I unlocked the door with the key the guy had mailed me. The inside smelled musty but not bad. Just like dry wood, maybe a bit of dust. There was a cot in one corner with an old sleeping bag on it. A table with 2 chairs. A small shelf with some canned food and a lantern. The wood stove sat near the far wall with a neat pile of chopped logs next to it. There was even a cast iron pan and a kettle hanging by the stove. I unpacked slowly, making sure everything was where I wanted it. I put my food in a crate near the shelf. I tested the hand pump outside. It worked, though it squeaked and coughed at first. The water was cold and clear. The outhouse didn't smell too bad, just old wood and dirt. After everything was set up, I sat on the front porch and just listened. I hadn't heard silence like that in years. Total silence. It was what I came for. The first night was cold. I got the wood stove going and slept on the cot in my own sleeping bag. I kept my flashlight near me, but I didn't need it. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire and nothing else. The second day was just as peaceful. I took a short hike through the woods. I followed the creek for about half a mile and found some animal tracks. Deer, maybe a fox. No signs of people. The trees were thick and the ground was soft with old leaves and moss. It was easy to get turned around, so I marked my path with pieces of cloth I had brought for that reason. I returned to the cabin before the sun dipped too low. I made soup on the stove, read a bit, then sat outside as the stars came out. But something changed the third morning. I had just stepped out to stretch when I noticed something strange. A tire track, a fresh one, just one. It hadn't been there the day before. It looked newer than the others I had seen when I arrived. I knelt down and touched it. The dirt was still a little soft from yesterday's rain. This was new. Someone had been here, or at least passed by. I looked down the trail, then into the woods, but I didn't hear or see anything. I told myself it was probably the owner checking on the place. Maybe he forgot something. Maybe he just drove by to make sure I had made it. Still, I didn't see any footprints near the cabin or anything else. Just the track. That night, I double-checked the lock on the door before sleeping. The silence felt heavier. I kept waking up, hearing small sounds outside. Maybe a branch, maybe wind. At one point, I sat up and held my breath. Sure, I had heard crunching in the leaves outside, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was a deer. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't want to go too far. I collected some more firewood, boiled water for drinking, and tried to stay relaxed. But I kept checking the trail. Nothing new. No more tracks. No signs of people. But I had that feeling in my gut, like something wasn't right, like I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I didn't light the lantern. I kept the fire low. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes open, listening. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was clear. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the side of the cabin. Not an animal, heavier, human. I didn't move. I just listened. They stopped near the porch. I didn't hear a knock. I didn't hear the steps leave either. Just silence again. When the sun rose, I got up and opened the door slowly. Nothing was there. No one. But there were footprints. Clear ones right by the porch. Big boots. Not mine. Someone had stood there for a while. Just standing. Watching. That was the moment something shifted in me. This wasn't some random hunter passing through. Whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen. And they came at night. They didn't knock. They didn't say anything. They didn't leave a note or call out. They just stood there and listened. Watched. I checked my supplies. Nothing missing. I still had food, water, tools. But now I kept my knife on me at all times. I moved some furniture in front of the door at night. I stopped using the lantern or fire after dark. I didn't want to be seen. For 2 days, nothing else happened. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe it was just some weirdo passing through. But on the 6th day, I saw it. Deep in the woods, maybe 100 yards off the trail, there was a truck. Half hidden behind some trees. No road leading to it. Just sitting there, off the ground slightly, like someone had parked it there weeks ago and left. But it wasn't old. It was clean. Newer model. The windows were tinted. I couldn't see inside. It wasn't crashed. Just parked in a place no normal person would leave a truck. I backed away without getting too close. I didn't touch it. I just walked back to the cabin slowly, calmly, like nothing was wrong. But inside I was shaking. Someone had driven that truck into the woods and left it there on purpose. They had gone through effort to hide it. It wasn't visible from the road. You had to be off trail to even spot it. That meant someone was camping out nearby, watching. That night I didn't sleep. At 3:12 a.m., I heard them again. This time closer, a quiet shuffle. Then the porch creaked. I gripped the knife, heart pounding. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For maybe 20 minutes, I heard nothing else. Then, a soft tapping on the window. Just one tap, like the sound of a fingernail. I stayed completely still. I didn't respond. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there in the dark, gripping the knife and staring at the door. Eventually, the tapping stopped. The next morning, I made the decision. I wasn't going to wait for whatever this was to escalate. I packed everything fast. I left some food behind to lighten the load. I kept my knife out and walked, not along the road, but straight through the woods. making a wide circle around where the truck had been. I didn't see it again. I didn't see anyone. I hiked fast, ignoring branches and thorns. I didn't stop to drink. I didn't stop to rest. I followed the sun and my compass. After 3 hours of fast walking, I hit the dirt road. I could see my car in the distance. Still there, no damage. But when I got to it, I noticed something chilling. Someone had wiped the back window. Just one clean swipe across the dust, like a hand had moved across it. Not to clean it, but to mark it, to let me know they were there. I got in and drove without looking back. I never reported it. I didn't have proof. No photos, no faces, no names. Just a gut feeling that someone was out there. Someone with a truck hit. I still don't know why I picked that place. I had options. I had time. I had a decent budget. There were safer choices, more normal places to stay. But something about getting far away from everything made it feel right. I told myself I needed peace, that I needed to clear my head, slow down, breathe fresh air, maybe get back to writing again. My apartment in the city had been draining me. Sirens, shouting, smog, gray buildings pressed up against each other like teeth in a clenched jaw. I hadn't slept well in months. I was worn out. That's why I went looking for something isolated, quiet. The listing described it as a fully stocked off-grid cabin deep in the northern hills, miles from the nearest road. It looked old but clean in the photos. Rustic, not broken. The wood looked dark but sealed, with a long porch that faced a slope covered in pine. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a wood stove, a propane cooktop, and a stack of books. They advertised it as a place for solitude. Writers, thinkers, artists. I imagined myself sitting on that porch with a notebook, watching deer or fog rolling over the tree line. What I got was something else. I drove 6 hours up the highway, then another hour down a gravel road. The road twisted endlessly through forest and scrub, until my phone lost all signal and the GPS gave up. By then, I was already committed. The last landmark was a metal cattle gate tied shut with rope and a white rock spray-painted with cabin trail. I followed a rutted path that went uphill for another 20 minutes, crawling along in low gear. When the trees opened up and I finally saw the cabin through the windshield, a part of me already knew I'd made a mistake. It looked older than in the pictures, smaller. The porch had a few boards that looked warped, and one of the windows was covered in plastic stapled across the frame instead of glass. The driveway wasn't really a driveway, just a wide patch of dirt and gravel with overgrown grass on both sides. There were no other houses nearby, no roads, no people, just silence and forest. I stepped out of the car and stood there for a long moment, holding my keys, not moving. The air was still. No birdsong, no wind in the trees, just the faint ticking of my engine cooling. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and old varnish. Inside, it was one big room with a small bathroom in back. A narrow cot, a long wooden table, shelves with canned food, a camp stove, a deep sink with a water barrel beside it. No fridge, just a cooler box. No electricity except a single solar light. A stack of wood beside the iron stove and a bundle of split logs in a box. A hand-drawn map on the wall showed trails leading into the trees. I unpacked my bags and tried to settle in. I told myself this was what I wanted. Quiet, space, no one around. But that night, when it got dark, it got really dark. The kind of darkness you forget exists when you live in the city. I lit a lantern and sat by the stove with a book, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing at the window. Every sound outside made me freeze. I heard cracking branches, something scuffling past the porch. Once, around midnight, I thought I heard something tap the wall on the far side of the cabin. But when I went out with my flashlight, nothing was there. Just trees and the slope dropping away into blackness. I barely slept. The next morning, I thought maybe I just needed time to adjust. I went for a walk. I took the trail behind the cabin, winding down through brush and trees. I found a small stream about half a mile in, clear water trickling over rocks. It was quiet but peaceful. I sat there for a while, watching the water. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were across the stream from me, on a muddy patch near the bank. Deep, narrow impressions. Too big for a child. Bare feet. Human. No shoes. The toes were clearly visible. For steps, all pointed toward the stream. No steps leading away. I stared at them for a long time. It had rained 2 nights ago, according to the owner's logbook in the cabin. The mud was soft but not fresh, meaning the tracks were recent. Maybe that morning, or the day before. But if someone had walked here barefoot, why? And where had they gone? I looked all around the forest on the other side of the stream. Nothing, just pine and brush. No sounds, no movement. I walked back to the cabin slowly, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. That night, I locked the door. There was a bolt and a sliding latch. I checked both, twice. I brought the axe inside. It was supposed to be for firewood, but I didn't like the idea of it being out on the porch. I sat by the stove again, reading, trying not to jump at every sound. When I finally went to bed, I left the lantern burning. I slept maybe 3 hours. The third day was when things started to feel wrong. Not just strange, but wrong. I woke up to find the front door slightly open. Not all the way, just a crack. I know I had locked it. I remember checking both latches. They were still in place, but the door had been pulled somehow, or maybe the frame was warped. I closed it again and checked the hinges. Nothing seemed broken. I convinced myself the wind must have forced it open, even though there had been no wind. I went outside to check the porch. That's when I found the dead rabbit. It was lying beside the steps. Its neck had been broken, not torn or bitten, just snapped. Its fur was clean. There was no blood, just a small, stiff body laid out as if someone had placed it there carefully. I didn't touch it. I went back inside, shut the door, and stayed there the rest of the day. I didn't read. I didn't write. I just sat by the stove, listening. I started to realize how far out I really was. No phone, no signal, no neighbors. No one even knew exactly where I was, except the cabin's owner, and I hadn't spoken to him in person. Everything had been arranged through a listing site. It had felt safe at the time. Now it didn't. That night, I barely slept again. Around 2 a.m., I heard something move on the porch. Slow footsteps. I held my breath and sat up, listening hard. The steps stopped near the door. Then silence. Then finally a single knock. Not loud, just a dull thud, like a knuckle on wood. Then nothing. I sat there holding the axe in both hands, staring at the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for something to crash through. But it never did. After maybe half an hour, I crawled across the floor and peeked through the side window. The moon was out, and I could just barely make out shapes on the porch. There was nothing there. The next morning, I wanted to leave. I started packing, but when I got to the car, I saw the tires. Both rear tires had been slashed. Not punctured, slashed. 2 clean horizontal cuts through the sidewalls, like someone had taken a blade to them. My hands were shaking when I touched them. That was when the panic started to settle in. Not the kind that hits all at once, but the slow, sinking dread that spreads through your whole body like cold water. I was stuck. No signal. No way to drive out. The trail was too long to walk easily, and I didn't even know which direction the nearest road was. The map on the wall showed trails, but none of them connected to anything useful. The cabin owner had said it was secluded. Now I understood just how much. I decided to stay inside and wait until morning. Maybe try to hike out at first light, find a better signal, flag someone down if I had to. But something about the forest felt wrong now. I didn't want to walk into it alone. That afternoon, I noticed something new. On the edge of the clearing, just past the tree line, something had been left against a trunk. A small bundle of twigs and feathers, tied with string. I didn't go near it. It hadn't been there the day before. It felt deliberate, like a marker or a warning. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the floor with my back against the stove, axe in my lap, ears straining for every sound. At some point, hours past midnight, I heard footsteps again. Not on the porch, this time circling the cabin. Slow, careful steps. Then tapping. Light tapping on the back wall. Then silence. Then more footsteps moving around the side. I didn't look out the window. I didn't want to see what was out there. I just stayed still, heart pounding, until the steps finally faded. When the sun came up, I left. I packed a small bag, enough water, a flashlight, and a knife. I left the rest behind. I locked the cabin, not that it mattered, and started walking. I took the trail downhill, past the stream, deeper into the woods. I had a compass and the printed map, but they weren't much help. The trees were too thick. Everything looked the same. I walked for hours. Around noon, I found something that made me stop. Another cabin. Smaller, older, not on the map. Half collapsed, roof sagging, one wall mostly gone. Looked abandoned, but on the door, still upright, there were scratches. Deep, uneven gouges, as if someone had dragged a blade across it over and over. Beside the steps, a pile of bones. I had been needing a break from everything. Work had been nonstop for months. My phone never stopped buzzing, and even on weekends, I couldn't seem to escape from emails, bills, or people needing something. I didn't have a family of my own. No wife, no kids, nothing tying me down except a small apartment in the middle of a noisy neighborhood. I wasn't sleeping right. I wasn't eating well. I'd get headaches almost every day from staring at screens or dealing with people. I finally decided I needed to unplug from everything. I told my job I was taking 2 weeks off. I didn't say where I was going. I didn't tell any friends either. I didn't want anyone checking on me. I just wanted to vanish for a little while. So I rented a cabin I found through a listing someone posted on an old online forum I used to visit. It wasn't even a commercial rental. It was more like a private listing. Some guy saying he had an off-grid cabin in the woods that he didn't use anymore. It had no internet, no phone service, no neighbors for miles. The photos he posted showed an old, weathered cabin, one story, with a small porch, a metal chimney, and a tiny wooden shed beside it. It looked quiet. No signs of civilization, just dense trees in every direction. I didn't ask many questions. I just paid the fee he wanted, got a GPS location from him, and set a date. I packed light. A week's worth of food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a few batteries, a book, a knife, a hatchet, and a solar power bank for my phone in case I needed GPS on the way back. I had zero intention of using my phone during the stay. I just wanted to be alone, breathe fresh air, and reset my mind. The drive was long. I had to take several turns through smaller and smaller roads. Eventually, I was on nothing but gravel paths cutting through the trees. My car bounced along the ruts. It was late in the afternoon when I finally reached the end of the path. There was a metal gate already open, and behind it, a clearing with the cabin exactly how it looked in the pictures. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I turned off the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening. No birds, no wind, just dead stillness. I assumed I just wasn't used to real quiet. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and walked up to the porch. There was a faint smell in the air. Not bad, but earthy, like damp wood and something faintly sour, maybe from the nearby shed. The cabin door was unlocked, like the owner said it would be. When I opened it, the hinges groaned. The air inside was musty, stale, like it hadn't been opened in weeks. Dust particles floated in the sunlight streaming through the one window. Inside, it was one main room. A cot in the corner, a fireplace on one wall, a small wooden table and 2 chairs. There were shelves along the wall filled with canned goods, a few old books, and what looked like a hunting rifle mounted above the window. I didn't touch it. I walked through the place slowly. The floor creaked under every step. I opened a small door beside the fireplace and saw a cramped bathroom. Just a toilet and a metal basin for washing up. The water came from a pump just outside the cabin. According to the owner, I gave it a test. It worked. Cold but clean. I set my stuff down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and stepped outside again. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows through the trees. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction. No signs of other people, no houses, no cars, just thick trunks and silence. That first night was calm. I ate some of my trail mix, drank from my water bottle, and sat on the porch watching the stars come out. I hadn't seen stars like that in years. No city lights to drown them out. It was beautiful. I went to bed early. I didn't even light the fireplace. It was summer, and the air was warm enough without it. I fell asleep quickly, for the first time in weeks. But I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. I just opened my eyes and felt something strange, like the air had shifted. The darkness in the cabin felt heavier. My ears strained for any sound. I thought maybe I heard something outside, a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. But it was so faint I wasn't sure if I imagined it. I sat up and listened. Nothing. I checked the window. It was too dark to see anything. No moon that night. I didn't go outside. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. I laid back down and stared at the ceiling for a while before sleep returned. The next morning, everything looked normal again. I walked the area around the cabin. There were no tracks in the dirt or mud. No signs of anything coming close. I chopped some kindling, read a few chapters of my book, and made a small fire that night just for the light. But I noticed something that evening. One of the cans on the shelf was gone. I had counted them when I arrived, just out of habit. There were 7. Now there were 6. I searched the cabin, thinking maybe I had moved one and forgot. But they were all in a neat row. I didn't move any of them. I checked my pack. Everything I brought was still there. It didn't make sense. I told myself I had just miscounted. I tried not to let it get to me, but the second night I woke up again. This time I heard it more clearly. Slow footsteps outside the cabin. They were soft, careful, but real. I wasn't dreaming. My heart started racing. I sat up and reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just held it. The steps moved from the front porch around the side of the cabin. I heard one of the boards creak out there. Then silence again. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. My ears burned from listening so hard. Nothing happened. Eventually, the silence stretched on, and I fell asleep from exhaustion. In the morning, I went outside. I searched the dirt around the porch. Nothing. No footprints. No disturbed leaves. I even walked into the woods a little, but found nothing strange. But when I came back, the door to the shed was open. I hadn't gone near the shed since I arrived. It was a small, weathered wooden structure maybe 20 feet from the cabin. The door was hanging open, not wide, just slightly ajar. I walked toward it slowly. I could smell that same sour odor again, stronger now. I pulled the door open wider. Inside it was dark, no windows. I turned on my flashlight. There were shelves inside, old tools, a rusted saw, some coils of rope, and a few boxes stacked on top of each other. But something about the boxes caught my attention. They looked too clean, like they had been used recently. I opened one. Inside was a stack of canned food, same kind as the ones in the cabin. There were more boxes. One had matches, batteries, even a few candles. It didn't look like old supplies. It looked like someone was still using them. I backed out of the shed and closed the door. I felt something in my stomach I hadn't felt in a long time. A twisting, cold unease. Someone had been here, maybe was still here. I walked back into the cabin and looked around. I hadn't locked the door the night before. I didn't even think to, but now I noticed the window had a latch from the inside. I made sure it was sealed. I checked my pack again. My knife was still there. I kept it in my pocket after that. The next few days were strange. Every night I heard something. Sometimes it was soft movement outside. Other times it was the creak of the porch boards or a scraping sound from the back wall. I didn't sleep much. I started to feel watched. I stopped going far into the woods. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. One morning, I woke up and found small pieces of bark and moss scattered near the door inside the cabin, like someone had tracked it in. I knew I didn't. I always took my boots off before entering. My boots were still by the door, but there were faint smudges near them on the floor, like dried mud. I cleaned them up and didn't know what else to do. I was stuck out there. No signal. No way to call anyone. I started staying up at night, sitting with the flashlight in my lap, listening, waiting. I barely slept. My thoughts grew scattered, my body tense all the time. I couldn't eat properly. Then one day, while I was out getting water from the pump, I saw something in the trees, just for a second. A shape, dark, low to the ground. It vanished before I could fully register it. But it had been watching me. That was the first time I seriously considered leaving early. But I didn't know if my car would even make it back down those roads in the dark. I decided to wait one more night and leave first thing at sunrise. That night, I locked the door, latched the window, and stayed up again. Around 3 a.m., I heard something press against the wall. A heavy, slow pressure. Not movement, just presence. Then the sound of a slow drag against the outside wall, like fingers or a tool scraping the wood. I sat in the dark, holding the flashlight, the knife beside me. My throat was dry. I didn't move until the sounds stopped over an hour later. When the sun finally came up, I grabbed my I didn't know anyone who had ever stayed there before. The listing just came up when I searched for cheap cabins near the mountains. I was looking for something quiet, not too expensive, and somewhere I could clear my head. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, barely thinking straight. I just needed time alone. Away from people, away from work, away from the city noise. The photos made it look all right. Old wooden walls, small kitchen, narrow bed, and a deck in the back that faced thick trees. The listing said it was next to a decommissioned rock quarry. It was supposed to be safe now, abandoned years ago. It didn't really matter to me. I wasn't planning on going for walks anyway. I just wanted to stay inside, sleep, maybe write in a notebook and cook some easy food. The price was right, so I booked it for 10 days. The drive out took longer than I thought. The cabin wasn't on a paved road. After 3 hours of highway, I had to drive up a narrow dirt trail that twisted around steep hills. I was going slow, but still my tires kicked up so much dust that I couldn't see behind me. I passed some open spaces that looked like they were once used for work trucks or maybe quarry equipment. There were piles of rock and gravel in places. Some of it looked fresh, even though the quarry was supposed to be shut down. I got to the cabin around 6 in the evening. It looked just like the pictures. Plain, quiet, kind of worn down, but not terrible. The porch creaked when I stepped on it. The wood on the deck was soft in some places, like maybe water had soaked through over the years. I had to jiggle the key in the lock a few times before it opened. Inside, it was cold. The place smelled like dry wood and maybe old cigarettes, but it wasn't awful. I unpacked a little, turned on the tiny heater near the wall, and sat on the bed. The mattress felt stiff, but I didn't care. I hadn't had a full day off in months. Even if I just laid there and stared at the ceiling, it would be better than home. I didn't do much that night. I ate some canned soup, drank a bottle of water, and then sat out on the deck for a bit. I didn't hear anything, no birds, no wind, no cars, just dead quiet. It was peaceful, but in a strange way. It almost felt too quiet. That night, I slept hard. My phone alarm didn't even wake me the first time. I stayed in bed for most of the morning, just feeling the stiffness in my back from the mattress and thinking about nothing. Around noon, I made some eggs on the small stove and sat at the table near the window. That's when I noticed something odd. There were boot prints on the porch. I hadn't seen them the night before. At first, I thought maybe they were mine, but I looked at my own shoes and they didn't match. My soles had a zigzag pattern. These prints were wide and deep, with a flat bottom and round edges. Big boots, heavy ones. It looked like someone had walked up onto the porch, then turned around and left. I checked the lock again. It was still latched. The window near the table was locked too. I told myself maybe it was the property owner checking in. Maybe he came early in the morning and left when he saw my car. That seemed possible. I tried to ignore it. The second night was still and dark. No moon, no stars. Just trees surrounding me, blocking everything. I kept the porch light on, but even that didn't reach very far into the woods. I didn't go outside. I just watched the dark through the window for a while, then went to bed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up because I thought I heard something on the porch, just a small sound, like a footstep maybe. I stayed very still and listened. Nothing else happened. No knocking, no voice, no lights, just silence again. I told myself it was probably an animal like a raccoon or maybe a deer. I forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I looked again. More boot prints. This time, they came from the dirt trail leading out of the woods. They walked up to the porch, then walked back into the woods again. The same shape, round-bottomed, flat-soled. Still didn't match mine. I was starting to feel uneasy. I didn't want to be paranoid, but it was getting harder to relax. I kept checking the windows, relocking the door, and listening at night. I didn't hear anything for a few nights, but every morning, more prints showed up. Sometimes they stopped at the porch. Other times, they circled the cabin. One morning, they were right outside my bedroom window. I started keeping a kitchen knife next to the bed. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have a gun. My phone only had 1 bar of service, and calls barely went through. I didn't want to leave, but I started counting the days. I kept telling myself I could handle it. 3 days left, then 2, then 1. On the second to last night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the sound of something brushing against the wall, like fabric or a coat dragging along the wood. I stayed awake until dawn, just sitting in the bed with the knife in my lap, heart pounding. When the sun came up, I finally dozed off for an hour. When I got up, I made coffee and opened the front door. I needed fresh air. I stepped out and looked down. There were no prints. Instead, the gravel had been smoothed out. Someone had dragged a piece of cloth or a branch to erase the tracks. It was too even to be wind or rain. It looked like someone didn't want me to see where they had walked. That was when I knew I wasn't imagining anything. I started packing. I didn't care that I had 1 night left. I wanted to leave before dark. I threw my clothes into the bag, grabbed my food, stuffed everything into the car. I went back inside to check for anything I'd missed, and when I walked out again, I froze. There was a man standing in the tree line, far back, maybe 40 feet into the woods. I couldn't see his face clearly. He was wearing a jacket and dark pants. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the cabin. At me. I didn't wave. I didn't shout. I backed into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the dirt road. When I did, he was gone. I drove straight through the night back to the city. I didn't even stop for food. I didn't sleep for almost 30 hours. I kept replaying it all in my head. The prints, the noises, the man. I still don't know what he wanted or how long he'd been watching. Maybe the whole time. Maybe before I even got there. A few days after I got home, I looked up the quarry. Turns out there had been a string of accidents there before it shut down. Not just rockfalls, but people disappearing. A worker went missing one morning, then a surveyor, then a local kid. The company closed the site not long after. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody found the bodies. I think the man in the woods had been using that cabin to watch people. Maybe it was his land before. Maybe he never left. Maybe he just waits for someone to show up so he can watch them from the trees, night after night. I never reported it. I didn't have anything solid to tell the police. I didn't even know if they'd believe me. The man never spoke, never broke in, never left a mark, just stared. Now I check every window before I sleep. I lock every door twice. I can't go into the woods anymore, not even at state parks, not even during the day. Something about trees and shadows makes my skin crawl, and I'll never stay in a cabin again. Not after that. I still think about the prints sometimes, how quiet it all was, how smooth the gravel was that last morning. I think about the way the man stood there, still as stone, and how he didn't run or speak or wave. He didn't need to. He already knew everything about me. I didn't think twice about leaving my phone on the kitchen counter that morning. I figured I wouldn't need it. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend alone in the woods, something I had done plenty of times before. I wasn't going far, just to a rented cabin in the forested hills about 2.5 hours from the city. The same one I had used last year. Same gravel road. Same rusty mailbox with peeling numbers at the turnoff. Same isolation. Same silence. That was what I wanted. I brought a duffel bag with clothes, a cooler filled with groceries, and a small box of firewood I had saved up from the previous winter. I had some books and a flashlight, a knife, a small first aid kit, some extra socks and thermal underwear just in case. The forecast looked clear. The road up to the cabin was rough but manageable. I took my old Tacoma, loaded it up early, and left the city while the sun was just starting to rise. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already warm on the hood, and the sound of pavement had long faded into the crunch of tires on gravel. The air smelled like pine needles and dirt, and there was a thick quietness out there that didn't exist in the city. I remember rolling down the window and letting the air blow in as I took the winding path to the cabin. I got there just after 9. The place looked the same as always. Wooden siding faded and dry, moss growing along the bottom logs, the small tin chimney already starting to rust a bit. I parked beside the old split rail fence and walked around the place once, just checking. There were no signs of damage, no trash, no broken windows, no footprints. Everything seemed fine. I unpacked my stuff slowly. I wasn't in any rush. I put my cooler inside by the counter, put the firewood beside the stove, and set up my sleeping bag on the wooden bunk bed in the corner. There was no electricity there, no running water, no cell service. That was part of the charm. The outhouse was about 30 yards out through a path behind the cabin. Just a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a crescent moon carved into the door like a joke. I used it, checked that there was enough toilet paper, and headed back inside. By noon, I had already made myself a sandwich and sat outside on the porch with a book in my lap, feet up on the railing, the wind barely moving the trees. Nothing felt wrong. I had no idea how much that phone would have mattered or how things would change in the next 48 hours. That first night was fine. It got cold quickly after the sun dropped, so I built a fire in the stove, lit a few candles, and made a simple dinner, rice and canned chicken. I sat inside and read for a while, dozing off a few times, before finally climbing into my sleeping bag around 10. The sounds of the forest at night were comforting back then. A few owls, some branches snapping in the distance, the creak of the cabin as it cooled. Nothing unusual. I fell asleep quickly and didn't wake up until morning. The next day started off the same, quiet, slow, peaceful. I made some instant coffee, stepped out onto the porch again, and watched the mist lift off the trees in the valley below. There were no other cabins nearby, not within a few miles at least. Just trees and birds and the occasional chipmunk running across the ground. I spent the day walking around a little, gathering some kindling and reading. I even took a nap out on the porch in the late afternoon, the sun warm on my legs. It was just after sundown that I noticed something strange. I was out by the outhouse again, just finishing up, and as I zipped up and turned to go back, I saw something on the ground that hadn't been there before. A boot print. It wasn't mine. The shape was wrong, too wide at the toe, and the tread wasn't like the kind on my hiking boots. It looked newer. The print was pressed deep into the dirt just off the main trail. The heel was slightly turned, like whoever left it had stopped mid-step and shifted their weight. I stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to remember if maybe it had been there before and I just hadn't noticed. But I knew I had walked this same path a few times already. I would have seen it. I looked around the trees, up the trail, and back toward the cabin, but I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything either, just wind and birds. I followed the boot print for a few feet and found another one, and then another, spaced out like someone walking slowly. The prints curved toward the back of the cabin and then disappeared into the grass. I felt the first ripple of unease then, that small cold twist in my gut. I tried to tell myself it was probably a hunter or some local guy walking through the woods, maybe from earlier that week. But the dirt was still soft. It had rained 2 days ago. That print couldn't have been older than a day. I walked back to the cabin, closed the door, and locked it. I didn't usually bother locking it when I was there alone, but something about the boot print stuck with me. I double-checked the windows too, making sure they were closed and latched. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. I kept my flashlight beside me, flicking it on every now and then to scan the room. I didn't hear anything out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. Just the idea of someone watching from the trees was enough to keep my chest tight with anxiety. I finally fell asleep sometime after 2. The candle burned down low, the room filled with the faint glow of embers from the stove. In the morning, I checked the area behind the cabin again. The boot prints were still there, but no new ones. I looked out along the trail in both directions and saw nothing. I tried to talk myself down. Maybe someone had passed through and just kept going. Maybe I was overreacting. Either way, I decided I would cut the trip short and head out that evening instead of staying a second night. I spent the rest of the morning packing up. I didn't rush, but I stayed alert. I put everything back in the truck except for the cooler. I planned to eat lunch before leaving. Just a sandwich, nothing that required cooking. I sat out on the porch again, sandwich on my lap, and listened. That's when I saw it, just for a second. Across the clearing, between the trees near where the trail curved uphill, something moved. It wasn't big, not a bear or anything like that. It was too quick, but it was a person. I saw part of a leg behind the tree trunk, jeans, maybe a dark jacket. Just a quick flicker of movement before they stepped behind another tree. I stood up fast, sandwich forgotten, and stared into the woods. My heart started pounding. I waited, eyes fixed on the spot, but I didn't see anything again. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I went inside, locked the door again, and got my knife out of the drawer by the stove. It was just a 6-inch fixed blade I used for chopping vegetables, but it felt better than nothing. I waited for another half hour before going back out to grab the cooler, looking both ways the entire time. When I got in the truck and started the engine, it was like a weight lifted. I backed up slowly, checked the mirrors again, and drove down the gravel road with my hands tight on the wheel. I didn't see anyone the whole way out, not along the road, not at the turnoff, not even at the small general store 10 miles down where I stopped for gas. I felt safer once I hit the highway again. I kept the windows up. I didn't stop anywhere else. I got home around 6. That's when I realized I had left my phone behind. It was on the kitchen counter where I'd forgotten it that morning I left. I almost laughed. I told myself it was fine. I was safe. But part of me couldn't stop thinking about that boot print. That flicker of movement behind the trees. That feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the cabin, about whether someone had been there, maybe even stayed there after I left. Maybe they were waiting for me to leave. The next morning, I decided to drive back out and get the phone. I didn't want to leave it there too long. I figured it would take less than 6 hours round trip, and I could be back before evening. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't really think about it. When I got there, everything looked normal at first. The front door was still closed. The grass didn't look disturbed. The windows were unbroken. I stepped out of the truck and walked to the porch slowly, scanning the trees the whole time. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cooler was still there, but the lid was off. I stopped in the doorway and looked around. My sleeping bag had been moved. It was unzipped and spread open like someone had laid on it. The chair I had sat in the first day was turned slightly, not the way I left it. And then I saw the fork. It was on the floor near the stove with bits of food on it. Someone had eaten while I was gone. My heart started racing. I backed out of the cabin slowly and turned around, scanning the tree line again. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched. I walked to the truck quickly and grabbed the tire iron from under the seat. I went back inside with the iron in one hand, knife in the other, and checked every corner. The small storage closet, under the bunk, behind the door, nothing. I grabbed my phone from the counter, turned it on, and waited. It lit up. No new messages, but the last photo on it made my blood go cold. It was a photo of me, sleeping, taken from inside the cabin. I stared at the screen for a long time, heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I've always been someone who liked being alone in the quiet. I work in a crowded city with too much noise, too many people, too much movement. It gets to a point where the traffic sounds and busy sidewalks start pressing on your brain. You can feel your body asking for silence, for space. That's why I started renting cabins a few times a year. Just me, alone in the woods, somewhere out of the way where the phone barely works and the only sound you hear at night is the wind going through the trees or maybe a few animals walking around outside. This time, I found a place online that seemed perfect. It was a private listing on a forum for outdoors enthusiasts. Someone said they had a minimalist, rustic cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. There were a few low-resolution pictures. The guy who posted it said there was no cell service, no internet, and that the nearest town was about an hour away by car. It wasn't listed on any rental sites, just that forum post and an email. I sent him a message, transferred the money, and a day later he gave me GPS coordinates and a long list of directions. He said, "Don't rely on your phone's GPS once you're close. It'll probably lose signal. Follow my directions carefully." I took a week off work, packed up food, clothes, gear, and drove for 2 days to get there. I arrived at the small gravel pull-off spot near the woods around 5 in the evening. There wasn't much there, just a faded sign nailed to a tree that said, "Private," and a barely visible trail leading through thick pine and birch forest. I left my car at the edge of the trees, grabbed my backpack, and followed the path. I remember the sound of my boots on the dry pine needles, the feel of the cooler air under the shade, and how the silence started to thicken the deeper I walked. After about 25 minutes, the trees cleared into a small open patch, and the cabin sat there like it had grown from the earth itself. Simple, one story, with wood that had turned gray with time. It looked old but sturdy. There was a small fire pit out front, a few stumps to sit on, and a woodpile stacked against one side. No power lines, no lights, no signs of modern life. Just the cabin and the forest. I unlocked the door using the key that was left under a flat stone near the steps, exactly where the guy said it would be, and stepped inside. The inside was as quiet as I expected. Wood walls, a small cot with a wool blanket, a table, 2 chairs, and some shelves holding basic supplies like matches, a lantern, canned food, and a few tools. There was a tiny bathroom in the back with a compost toilet and a water jug for washing. Everything smelled like dust and pine, with a faint hint of old smoke. I dropped my bag, set my food in the corner, and sat down to breathe it in. Felt right. That first night, I built a small fire outside, heated up some soup, and sat under the stars. I hadn't seen that many stars in years. I didn't think about anything except how far away everything was. No emails, no cars, no noise. Just the woods and the crackling of the fire. When I went back inside to sleep, I felt safe. More than safe, I felt like I was nowhere, and I liked that. The first 2 days passed peacefully. I hiked a few trails during the day, cooked simple meals on the portable burner I brought, read an old paperback I found on the shelf, and napped. The wind moved through the trees during the day, and at night I heard raccoons or maybe deer moving through the brush. It was calm. I didn't hear a single human voice or engine. I felt like I was finally away from the world. On the 3rd night, something changed. I had just eaten dinner and was washing up at the small sink with water from the jug when I noticed something odd about the wall above the table. One of the wooden planks had a small dark circle near the top corner, about the size of a dime. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't a knot in the wood, it was too perfect, too round. I got closer and looked at it carefully. It didn't look like a hole from an old nail or screw. It looked newer, cleaner. Something about it bothered me. I got the flashlight and shone it directly into the circle. The light didn't reflect. It just went black, like the surface inside was matte. I got a chair, stood on it, and gently pressed around the plank. Nothing moved. I reached into my bag for my pocket knife, got the blade behind the edge of the board, and pried just a little, not to break anything, just enough to peek. The wood was thin, and behind it was a hollow space. I widened the gap with the blade and finally saw it. There was a small black camera hidden behind the wall. It was small, like a webcam, tucked into a cutout in the wall with wires running sideways out of view. It was angled downward, pointing directly at the table. I just stared at it for a few seconds. The lens was clean, not dusty. That meant someone had accessed it recently. I felt my chest tighten. I backed down off the chair and just stood there, staring at that wall. I looked around the cabin, at the corners, at the shelves, at the space above the door. Then I went to the bookshelf and took every book off, checking behind. I looked under the bed, behind the mirror in the bathroom, behind the supply shelf. I found 2 more small cameras, one inside a knothole near the bed, and one hidden behind a small cut in the corner beam near the bathroom. My heart was pounding. The cameras weren't covered in dust, not like the rest of the cabin. They looked new. I traced the wires as far as I could. They ran into the wall and disappeared. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and went outside. I walked around the back of the cabin, looking for anything, an antenna, a power source, anything unusual, and I found it. Behind the woodpile was a locked wooden box, not too big, bolted to the ground. It wasn't there in the pictures I saw online. I got a rock and broke the padlock open. Inside was a black case with a small screen and a battery pack. The camera wires ran into this case. The cameras were live, they were recording to a hard drive. I just stood there, staring at it. My thoughts were racing. Who was watching? Why? Was this some sick game? Had they seen me sleeping, changing everything? I yanked the wires out and took the whole case inside. I didn't know what to do. There was no cell service, no internet, no way to contact anyone. The road was an hour away by foot, and my car was parked in the middle of nowhere. I stayed awake all night, the lantern on low, holding the knife in my hand. The first light, I packed everything. I left the cameras on the table, smashed open. I stuffed the black case in my bag and hiked out as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, listening for footsteps, watching the trees. When I got back to my car, I didn't even stop to rest. I threw my bag in the back, turned the key, and drove until I saw the first sign of cell service, about 40 miles down the road. Then I stopped and called the police. I told them everything. I gave them the coordinates, the photos I took of the cameras, and the black box. They said they'd send someone out. I didn't hear anything for days, and when I called again, they told me the cabin was empty when they arrived. No cameras, no recording box, nothing. Just an empty cabin. They said there was no sign of forced entry or surveillance equipment. The guy who rented it to me, the email account was deleted. No trace. Gone. I didn't sleep for a week after that. I kept thinking about how many other people stayed there, how many were watched, recorded. For what? Blackmail? Some dark website? I'll never know. I still have the photos. I still have the black box. I gave a copy to the police, but they said without proof of who put it there, there's not much they can do. That trip changed something in me. I still love the woods, but I don't trust places like that anymore. Not if I didn't build it myself, not if I don't know every wall and every corner. I installed security cameras in my apartment. I check every hotel room, every Airbnb, every bathroom mirror. I thought I was getting away from the world by going off-grid. I didn't realize I was walking straight into someone else's game. And the worst part is, I'll never know if they're still watching, or who they even were. All I know is they picked me, and I found what I wasn't supposed to see. I had rented the cabin months before summer. I booked it for 10 days straight, way ahead of time, because the place was hard to get. It was tucked away in a valley about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. A long gravel road led to it after you turned off the highway. There were no nearby towns for at least 25 miles in any direction. Just forest. Thick, dense pine and birch forest, with narrow hiking trails that twisted along the river behind the cabin and wound deep into the mountains. I chose this place because I wanted peace and quiet. I wanted to get away from everything. It was a small cabin, nothing fancy. It had 2 rooms. One was the living space with a couch, a fireplace, a table, and a small kitchen against the wall. The other was a bedroom, barely enough room for a bed and a chest of drawers. The bathroom was outside, just a small outhouse 20 feet from the front porch. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just a radio and a few solar-powered lights. That was what I wanted. No distractions. Just me, some books, a couple of frozen meals in the cooler, and some hiking to clear my head. I got there in the afternoon, around 3:30 p.m. The sky was a dull gray, and the air smelled like it was going to rain. The forest felt quiet, heavier than I expected. It wasn't eerie, at least not yet, but there was a stillness to it. The kind that made you keep checking over your shoulder even though you weren't expecting to see anyone. I brought my gear in, set my bag by the bed, and put a few groceries in the mini fridge. Everything was normal. The first day passed slowly. I sat out on the porch for a while, just listening to the birds and the wind moving through the trees. That night, I built a small fire inside and read a couple chapters of a novel before going to sleep around 10. The silence was nice. No car horns, no buzzing phone, no noise from the neighbor's TV through the walls. Just wind and the faint sound of the river in the distance. On the second day, I hiked the trail behind the cabin. It was marked with faded orange paint on the trees, and I followed it for about 2 hours until I reached a shallow clearing. I ate a sandwich there and took a few photos. On the way back, though, I started to get a strange feeling. I don't really know what caused it. It wasn't any one thing. It was just a prickly kind of awareness, like someone was watching me from the woods. I stopped and looked around a few times, scanning between the trees, but saw nothing. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It happens in the woods, especially when you're alone. Your brain looks for shapes in the shadows, movements in your peripheral vision. But still, that feeling didn't fully go away, even after I got back to the cabin. I chalked it up to being alone too long and tried to ignore it. That night, I made some food and sat on the porch as the sun went down. It got colder, and I heard some rustling in the bushes near the tree line, maybe 30 feet away. It wasn't loud. Could have been a raccoon or something. I used my flashlight to scan the edge of the woods, but didn't see anything. Still, I went inside a little earlier than I had planned. Just felt better being behind a locked door. The next morning, I found boot prints near the firewood pile. That was when things changed. I had a small stack of split firewood under a slanted roof beside the cabin. I hadn't gone over there since the night before, but that morning, when I stepped outside to get some wood for the stove, I saw the prints in the dirt and damp pine needles. They were clear, heel to toe, heavy like work boots, and they weren't mine. I looked closer. The stride was shorter than mine, and they came from behind the cabin, curved along the sidewall and stopped by the woodpile. Then they disappeared into the forest again. I stood there for a while just staring at them. I kept going over it in my head. Could I have made them yesterday? Did I go around that side and forget? But I knew I didn't. I would have remembered walking over there. And the boots didn't match mine. My shoes were hiking sneakers. These were wider. The tread was different. That day I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the axe within reach just in case. I walked around the property, scanning the trees, but never saw anything. I couldn't hear anything either, and the silence now felt wrong, like a waiting kind of silence. I kept feeling like I was being watched again. I'd turn and stare into the trees and feel almost sure that someone was standing there, just far enough back that I couldn't see them. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to small sounds. A branch breaking, a scrape against the wall. Once, I thought I heard something move across the porch. I got up, pulled the curtain back slowly, and looked out through the window. Nothing, just the woods and the pale blue light from the moon. But I knew someone had been near the cabin. Those boot prints were real. On the 5th day, I found more signs. I went outside after the sun came up and walked a slow circle around the cabin. About 20 feet behind it, I found something that made my chest tighten. It was a cigarette, but still fresh, sitting near the base of a tree. Still a little ash left on it. I don't smoke. No one else was supposed to be out here. There were no other cabins for miles. The road ended here. There weren't even rangers nearby. Whoever had been near the cabin had stayed close enough to sit down and have a smoke. That meant they were watching me, listening, waiting. I went back inside and stayed there the rest of the day. I kept all the doors locked, kept the hatchet beside me on the table. Every couple hours I would look out through the windows, slowly, making sure no one was out there. Around 4 p.m., I noticed something else. Something small. One of the windows on the side of the cabin, the one by the kitchen, was open a crack. Just barely, maybe half an inch. I hadn't opened it. That window didn't even have a screen. I closed it and locked it, and that was when I decided I wasn't staying the full 10 days. I made up my mind to leave the next morning. I figured I'd pack everything and drive out early. There wasn't any cell service in the cabin, but there was a signal if you walked 15 minutes up the trail to the east. I'd done that on the first day just to check in with a friend. I told myself I'd go up there and send a message once I packed. But that night didn't go how I expected. I made sure every window and door was locked. I pushed the couch in front of the door just to feel a little safer. I didn't sleep much. I stayed dressed. I kept the hatchet in my hand. At some point in the night, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps on the porch. I was lying on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and I heard them, slow, one after the other, then a long pause, then one more. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My heart was beating so hard it hurt. The steps didn't go away. They shifted slightly. Then I heard the soft creak of the wooden boards. Someone was right outside the door. I didn't go near the window. I just waited. Eventually, the steps moved again, back off the porch. Then nothing. Silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like 2 hours before I dared to move. I didn't turn on any lights. I just waited for dawn. When the sun came up, I grabbed my backpack, threw everything I could into it, and left most of the other stuff behind. I got in my car and drove, fast. Gravel spitting under the tires, potholes slamming the frame. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and I didn't feel calm until I passed through a small town with a gas station. I pulled in, sat in the lot, and just breathed for 10 minutes. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't even want to talk about it. But after a few days, I told a friend. He thought maybe it was just a local, some hiker or poacher who wandered too close. But it wasn't that. A week later, I got a call from the rental company. They told me the next guest who arrived found the cabin trashed. The couch was overturned. The bedroom window was smashed. And inside the bedroom, they found boot prints across the floor and a torn sleeping bag in the corner. One I didn't bring. There was also a note, written on the wall in marker. "You shouldn't have locked the window. I never went back." I had been feeling worn out for a while. Work had been heavy, and the constant noise of the city made my head feel like it was always spinning. I needed space, stillness, somewhere far where I could feel the air and not hear anything but the wind and the trees. That's when I decided to spend a full week alone in a rented cabin out in the woods of northern Montana, deep in a forested area near a place called Condon. I had found the place on an old travel forum. It wasn't listed on any major rental site, and I had to wire the money directly to the owner. It was cheap, cheaper than I expected, and it came with a warning that there was no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no nearby neighbors, and that I needed to bring everything I might need, including food, water, and emergency supplies. That didn't bother me. That was the point. I wanted complete quiet. I packed enough to last me 10 days, even though I only planned to stay 7. I brought batteries, flashlights, canned food, a water filter, a small solar-powered lantern, and a full tank of gas in my car, which I parked about half a mile away from the cabin, down a gravel road that cut off from the main highway. I didn't want to be completely isolated in case of car trouble, so I parked at a spot where I could still get a weak signal if I walked up the ridge a bit. When I reached the cabin, it looked just like the few pictures the owner had emailed me. It was small, with old wooden logs stacked unevenly, a metal roof that was turning orange with rust, and a little deck with 2 chairs facing the woods. There was one small window in the front and one in the back, both with thick wooden shutters. Inside, there was a single room with a cot, a table, a propane stove, and a wood-burning stove for heat. There was also an outhouse about 30 yards to the left of the building. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I wanted. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, walked around the nearby trees, and just listened. I didn't realize how loud the city had been until I sat on the porch of the cabin that first night and realized I could hear the creaking of the trees when the wind moved through them. I didn't hear a single plane overhead, not even a distant engine. Just the wind, the birds, and the creaking of the trees. By the second day, I had already started to relax. I woke up late, warmed some canned food over the stove, and sat on the deck reading an old book I had brought. I hiked out about 2 miles down a path that went deeper into the forest and followed a dried-up creek for a while. I found deer tracks, old scat, and a fallen tree that looked like it had been cut, even though I didn't think anyone came this deep into the woods. That night, I went to sleep early and slept straight through. It was on the third morning that I noticed something strange. I had placed a small hand axe outside the cabin next to a chopping block I was using to split kindling for the stove. That morning when I went out, the axe was missing. I figured I had forgotten to bring it back inside or maybe kicked it somewhere by accident. I spent about 20 minutes looking around for it, thinking maybe I'd left it leaning against the back wall or dropped it on my way to the outhouse. But it was gone. I eventually let it go and used the backup folding saw I had in my bag to cut up a few branches for the fire. I told myself maybe I had left it at the creek the day before or dropped it somewhere while walking. That night, I sat outside again. It was colder and the wind had picked up. The trees made more noise than usual, and I noticed that the air felt different, like it was heavy in a way that's hard to explain. I went inside earlier than I had the night before and double-checked the shutters and door before I lay down. On the fourth day, I found the axe. It was stuck in a tree about 30 feet from the cabin, the blade buried cleanly into the bark at head height. It hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of that. I had walked past that same tree when I went out to gather firewood in the morning and again when I had gone to the outhouse at night. But there it was, clean, sharp, and perfectly lodged into the trunk. My heart started beating faster the moment I saw it. It wasn't rusted or dirty, so it hadn't been there long, and it was placed too neatly to have been thrown or dropped by accident. Someone had walked up to that tree and pressed the axe into it on purpose. I stood there staring at it for a while, not sure what to do. The first thought in my head was that someone was playing a prank on me. Maybe the owner had a neighbor who knew someone had rented the place and decided to mess with me. But I hadn't seen or heard a single person since I arrived. I hadn't seen tire tracks, footprints, wrappers, nothing that showed someone else was around. I pulled the axe out of the tree and brought it back inside. That night, I didn't go outside. I bolted the door, even though the bolt was just a simple hook latch, and I moved one of the chairs against the door from the inside. I didn't sleep much. By the fifth day, I was checking around the cabin constantly. I went out and walked the perimeter in a wide circle, looking for signs that someone had been nearby. About 50 yards to the south of the cabin, I found a pile of ash and burned wood, fresh, still warm when I pressed my hand near it. That wasn't there before either. It was hidden behind a thicket, tucked into a little dip in the forest floor. Someone had built a small fire there recently, maybe within the last day. My heart was beating so fast I felt lightheaded. I crouched down and looked closer. There were bits of food in the ash, charred pieces of something like meat, a few broken pieces of plastic that looked like they were from a wrapper. But there were no footprints. The ground was covered in pine needles and old leaves, and the soil was dry and loose, so I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door. That afternoon, I packed up everything except what I needed for the night. I planned to leave the next morning. The rental was supposed to be for 2 more days, but I didn't want to wait. I told myself it wasn't worth the risk. I had come out here to get away from people, but now I was scared someone was watching me. That night, just before I was about to fall asleep, I heard a sound. It was faint but clear. It came from outside, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the cabin. It sounded like someone walking slowly, each step crunching lightly on the ground. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still in the cot, my eyes wide open, breathing through my nose as quietly as I could. The steps circled the cabin once. Then they stopped. I didn't hear anything for a long time after that. My chest was tight, and my stomach felt like it had turned to stone. I stayed awake until morning. When the sun came up, I packed the last of my things and left. I didn't clean the cabin or check the shutters. I just locked the door, jogged up the trail with my bag, and didn't look back. When I reached my car, I unlocked it fast, threw everything in the back seat, and drove down the gravel road as quickly as I could without losing control. But it didn't end there. About 10 miles down the road, when I pulled over to check my tires and calm myself down, I found something under my windshield wiper. It was a piece of paper folded in half. I opened it. There was no writing, just a single red circle drawn with something like a crayon. It looked like a target, a bullseye. My hands were shaking. I looked around the woods near the road, scanning the trees. There was no one, no sign of another car, just that same cold wind moving through the trees. I didn't stop again until I reached the nearest gas station, over 30 miles away. I told the clerk that someone had been following me or messing with me in the woods, but he just shrugged, said the woods were full of loners and off-grid types, and some of them didn't like people coming into their space. That was months ago. I still think about it every night. The axe in the tree, the fire pit behind the thicket, the footsteps, the paper under the wiper. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. There was no crime, no real proof, just fear. But that cabin, those woods, they weren't empty. Someone was out there, watching, and I don't think I was the first one, or the last. I was tired of the city. It had started to feel like it was closing in on me. Noise, traffic, people yelling, phones buzzing, endless schedules. Everything about it had started to feel like too much. I had saved some money over the last few years and needed to clear my head. So I decided to go somewhere far, somewhere quiet, somewhere where there were no horns, no elevators, no glowing screens, just trees, water, and silence. A friend of mine had a small hunting cabin in the northern part of the state, way up near the border where there weren't many people. He told me I could use it for as long as I wanted. It didn't have electricity, no running water, no cell signal. Just a small wood cabin, a lake nearby, and lots of woods. I packed clothes, some food, tools, my knife, a small axe, and a few other things I thought I might need. I brought a generator too, just in case, and some gas, but I planned to use it as little as possible. I wanted to disconnect completely. It took me almost a full day of driving. Most of the trip was just long highways, then 2-lane roads, and finally a dirt trail that went deep into the forest. The farther I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No houses, no power lines, no parked cars. Just endless trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just as he'd described. Simple, small, made of old dark wood, with a small stone chimney and a little porch with a wooden bench. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the wind passing through the trees and the occasional creak of the wood under my boots. The first few days were peaceful. I cut some firewood, set up a small rain-catching system for water, and did some basic cleaning inside the cabin. It hadn't been used in a while. There were a few old mouse droppings and some cobwebs in the corners, but nothing serious. I cooked on a small camping stove, ate mostly canned food, and spent the evenings reading by lantern light or just staring out into the dark forest. It was quiet, and that's exactly what I needed. On the fourth night, something strange happened. I had been outside most of the day, chopping wood and walking along the edge of the lake nearby. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. But when I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I remembered shutting it firmly before I left. I always checked it twice. I didn't lock it, it had no lock, but I always made sure it was fully closed. At first, I thought maybe I just didn't close it properly. Maybe the wind pushed it open. I pushed the door slowly and stepped inside. Everything seemed to be in place. My gear was where I left it. My food was untouched. The axe was still leaning against the wall. Nothing looked stolen or broken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the door. I listened to every creak, every little sound the wind made against the walls. It was cold. I kept the fire going low, just enough to warm the room. At some point, I must have dozed off. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to look for tracks. It had rained the night before, so the ground was soft. Near the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. They weren't mine. I always wore heavy hiking boots, and these were different. Lighter. The prints were spaced wider, too. Longer strides. Someone had been near the back of the cabin, walking along the wall, possibly looking through the small window near the back. I looked around the area, but the trail ended where the ground became drier and hard-packed. I couldn't follow it. I stood there for a long time, listening, trying to pick up any sound, but there was nothing. No birds, no animals, nothing moving. Just silence. I told myself maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe someone just stumbled across the cabin and took a look. But something didn't sit right. The way the footprints circled the cabin. The fact that the door was open. It didn't feel like an accident. That day I stayed close. I kept the axe with me. I didn't go down to the lake. I didn't wander into the woods. I made food inside, kept the fire going, and stayed alert. I checked the windows more than once. I listened for footsteps, twigs snapping, anything. But the day passed without event. At night, I moved the table in front of the door. It wasn't very heavy, but it made me feel better. I kept the axe close to the bed. I barely slept. The next morning, I went outside and checked again. More footprints. This time on the side of the cabin where the small shed was. The prints came from the woods, passed near the window, and then disappeared into the trees again. Whoever it was had come back. I decided to stay one more day. If anything else happened, I'd pack up and leave. I liked the quiet, but this was something else. I didn't want to be paranoid, but it was starting to feel like someone was watching me, like someone knew I was alone out here. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard something outside. It was faint, like a foot stepping on dry leaves. Then nothing. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer. A slow, deliberate step, then another, then silence. I sat up in bed, holding the axe tightly in both hands. The fire had burned down. The room was dark except for a little glow from the last embers. I didn't move. I just listened. I heard breathing. It wasn't mine. It was outside the window. Slow, quiet breathing, like someone trying not to be heard. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then the breathing stopped, and I heard a soft tap, like a finger gently touching the glass. I sat there for what felt like hours. The sun eventually came up. When light finally filled the room, I moved. I pushed the table aside and opened the door slowly. The morning air was cold. The ground outside was covered in dew, except for a spot right under the window. There, I saw a single footprint, pressed deeply into the wet soil. I packed up fast. I threw everything in the truck. I didn't even eat. I didn't care about the food I left behind. I just wanted to leave. But when I got in the truck and turned the key, nothing happened. The engine clicked but didn't turn over. I tried again. Still nothing. The battery was dead. I opened the hood and checked the cables. They were loose. Not just loose, unscrewed. Someone had been under the hood and taken the connectors off the battery. I hadn't done that. I screwed them back in with shaking hands, trying to keep calm, looking over my shoulder constantly. Every sound made me flinch. Felt like I was being watched. I finally got the truck started, threw it in reverse, and backed out so fast I almost hit a tree. I drove down the trail, trying to go as fast as possible without damaging the truck. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I reached the small town where I had bought gas earlier that week, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. They sent a deputy with me to check the cabin. We found more footprints. The back window had a smudge on it, like someone had pressed their face against the glass. But nothing was stolen, nothing broken. It was like whoever it was didn't want anything, just to scare me. The deputy said sometimes hermits live out there in the woods. People who don't want to be found. People who watch hikers, campers, even cabins. He said maybe someone thought I was trespassing. Maybe they wanted me to leave. If that was the case, it worked. I never went back to that cabin again. My friend eventually sold the property. He said it didn't feel safe anymore, even though nothing else ever happened. But I still think about it sometimes. About the breathing outside the window, the soft tap on the glass, the footprints, the truck battery. It was a place that was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, safe. But someone else was out there, and they weren't supposed to be. I decided to take a break from everything. City noise, work stress, constant calls, notifications, people, all of it. I needed time to think, to breathe, to be alone without anyone asking me for anything. That's why I rented a small off-grid cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho, near the edge of a national forest. It was the kind of place that didn't show up on maps unless you zoomed all the way in. The nearest town was about 45 minutes away by car, and that was only if the dirt road wasn't blocked by snow or fallen trees. I drove up there in late October, just before the snow season hit hard. The guy who owned the cabin said he only rented it out to people who knew how to handle being alone. I told him I did. I had camped before, I liked being in the woods, and I wanted to get away. He gave me a simple set of instructions. Haul in your own water, bring extra gas, have a backup radio, and don't expect anyone to check in on you unless you called first. He was clear about that. The cabin was a plain wooden structure. One story, small porch out front, with stove inside. It had no electricity, no cell signal, no internet, nothing. Just a couple of lanterns, a gas stove, a small fridge that ran off propane, and a bed that felt more like a cot. It had 2 rooms, the main room with the kitchen and the bed, and a smaller back room with tools, extra firewood, and some storage boxes. There was also an outhouse about 15 steps out the back door. I brought in my own supplies, canned food, water, batteries, warm clothes, a solar power bank, and a backup radio. I parked my truck under a tarp near the trees where it wouldn't be visible from the trail. The guy who rented me the place said most people didn't even know it existed, and I liked that. I liked knowing I could disappear for a while and not be found unless I wanted to be. For the first 2 days, it was exactly what I needed. The air was cold and dry. I chopped some wood for the stove, went for long hikes during the day, and sat near the fire at night writing in a notebook. I slept more than I had in months. No sounds but the wind in the trees, birds, and the occasional rustle in the brush. I felt like I was in control again. But then things started to change. The first odd thing happened on the 3rd morning. I had left my hatchet stuck in the chopping block outside the night before. When I went out that morning, it was gone. Not fallen, not misplaced, gone. The chopping block was still there. The wood I had split was in the same pile, but the hatchet was missing. I checked everywhere around the area thinking maybe a raccoon dragged it off, or it fell into a crack in the woodpile, but nothing. It was just gone. I figured maybe I'd find it later and used my backup axe instead. Later that day, I hiked along the tree line past the old dried-up creek, about a half mile from the cabin. I wasn't really trying to go anywhere, just walking to clear my head. I didn't bring my phone since there was no signal, but I had my compass and watch. I noticed boot prints in the dirt that weren't mine. At first, I thought they might have been left by hunters or hikers days ago, but the ground was still soft from the rain 2 days earlier, and they looked fresh. I compared the size to my own boots. They were bigger, maybe size 12 or more, heavier tread like work boots. I hadn't seen anyone else since arriving, and I doubted anyone would come this far into the woods without making noise or leaving a car nearby. But I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe they passed by earlier in the morning. That night, it snowed lightly, just enough to cover the ground and quiet everything. I was sitting by the wood stove around 9 p.m., writing, when I heard a thud outside. Not the kind of noise wind makes, more like something hit the side of the cabin. I froze. It was just one thud, low and short, like someone kicked the wall. I turned off the lantern and waited in silence. I didn't hear anything else. After about 10 minutes, I put on my coat, grabbed the flashlight and my knife, and stepped out onto the porch. There were no tracks, no movement in the woods, no sign of anything. But then I saw something strange. On the side of the cabin, just below the back window, were 3 small scratch marks. Not deep, not from claws. They looked like someone dragged a metal tool or stick across the wood. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The snow on the roof hadn't slid down. It was something else. I backed inside and pushed the dresser against the door just in case. The next morning, I went out early to look around again. The snow made it easier to see tracks. There were 2 sets of footprints circling the cabin. One came from the woods and stopped at the front porch, the other looped around back. Both went back into the trees, heading northwest. The prints weren't mine. They were wide-set, heavy steps, deep in the snow. I followed one set for a little while, maybe 200 yards, before they disappeared near the ridge. It was like whoever made them stepped up onto the rocks and vanished. That day, I felt uneasy for the first time since I arrived. I couldn't explain it. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the woods too quiet. I kept checking the windows, listening for sounds, trying to focus on anything else. Couldn't. I felt like I was being watched, though I saw no one. That night, I stayed inside with all the lamps off. I kept the fire low to avoid casting shadows on the windows. Around midnight, I heard the sound again, this time lighter, slower. It was footsteps. I knew the sound of snow being crushed under heavy boots. I heard them stop at the porch. Then, the faintest creak, like someone pressing weight on a wooden board. Then nothing. I sat with the knife in my hand, barely breathing. I stayed that way until the first light of morning. When I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, the prints were there again, this time just one set. They had come right up to the porch, stopped by the window, then left. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but I felt sick. Whoever it was, they were watching the cabin, maybe even me, and they knew I was inside. I didn't have any way to call for help. The radio only worked if I climbed the ridge about a mile away. I hadn't needed to use it before, but now I was thinking about it. I packed a small bag with water, a flashlight, my knife, and the radio, then waited until the afternoon to make the hike. I didn't want to go up in the morning in case the person was still nearby. I made it to the ridge in about 30 minutes, heart racing the whole time. I turned on the radio and tried to reach the ranger station frequency listed in the manual. Took a few tries, but eventually I got a reply. I explained I was at a private cabin, that I wasn't hurt, but that someone might be trespassing. They said they'd send someone by the next day to check it out, but warned it might take a while depending on snow conditions. As I hiked back, I saw something that stopped me cold. About halfway down the slope, near a cluster of boulders, was a freshly broken branch. It had been snapped off a pine tree about 7 feet up, and the snow around it had been disturbed. Not by an animal, it looked like someone had been standing there watching the trail, and near the base of the tree there was a cigarette butt, still fresh. Whoever had been there was probably watching me hike up and never followed. They just stood there and watched. When I got back to the cabin, the door was cracked open, just slightly, but enough that I knew I hadn't left it like that. I kept the knife in my hand as I went inside. Everything looked the same at first. The stove was cold. My bag was where I left it. But then I noticed the journal I had been writing in was gone. I looked everywhere for it. It was just gone. I stayed up the whole night, sitting with my back to the wall and my eyes on the front door. Nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, maybe still was, hiding. I checked the small back room. I opened every box. Nothing. I checked under the bed. Nothing. But I still couldn't relax. The next morning, I planned to leave. I packed all my things, loaded the truck, and made sure everything was ready. But when I turned the key, the truck wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I popped the hood and found the battery cables had been cut. Clean. With a knife or wire cutter. That was when I knew this wasn't some random drifter or animal. Someone was trying to trap me here. They didn't want me to leave. I went back inside and locked the door again. I knew the ranger wasn't coming until later that day, maybe not even then. I couldn't hike to town, too far with supplies, and I didn't know if whoever was out there would let me get far. I took every tool I could find, screwdrivers, nails, hammer, and blocked the windows from the inside. I put the dresser back against the door. I made a small trap with a string tied to a pot near the back window. If someone came in, it would fall. That night was the longest of my life. Around 2 a.m., I heard the back window slide open, slowly. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then I heard the pot fall and clang on the floor. I ran toward the sound with the flashlight and saw the window was open, but no one was there. Footprints in the snow showed someone had jumped back out and ran into the trees. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, I heard an engine. It was faint but real. I ran out front and waved my arms. A Forest Service truck was slowly coming up the trail. When they arrived, I explained everything. I needed to get away. Things had been piling up in my life. Long hours at work, constant traffic, emails that never stopped coming. I had started waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. and I felt like I hadn't had a proper full breath in weeks. So when I found a listing for a small off-grid cabin tucked away in the northern mountains, I booked it without much thought. It was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, just trees, birds, maybe some snow, and no people. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from my place. Most of it was along the highway, but the last stretch was rough. I drove slowly along a narrow dirt road that twisted through thick woods. The trees leaned in close, their branches hanging low. There were no signs, no fences, no gates. Just the sound of my tires cracking twigs underfoot and the occasional crow flying overhead. I followed the GPS and eventually came to a clearing where the cabin sat. It looked small but solid, built from dark logs with a steep tin roof. A little chimney poked out the top, and smoke curled from it. That surprised me. I hadn't expected anyone to be there. But then I remembered that the place was owned by an old couple who lived nearby. They probably came by earlier and got the place ready. Maybe they lit the stove to warm it up for me. I parked beside the cabin and stepped out. The air was cold but clean. I could smell pine, smoke, and damp leaves. There was no wind, just stillness. I carried my bags inside and looked around. The inside was simple. Just one main room with a bed, a small table, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow kitchenette against the far wall. A door to the side led to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet. There was no running water, just a big blue jug on the counter and a basin. No electricity either. A few oil lamps were placed on shelves. It was exactly what I wanted. No internet, no TV, no neighbors. Just silence. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, took a walk around the area, and chopped a bit of firewood using the old axe I found leaned up against the cabin. There was a shed out back, half sunken into the earth, filled with tools, extra firewood, and a few rusted things that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. That night, I sat near the stove and read a paperback I had brought. The fire crackled softly. The shadows moved along the walls in that slow way firelight does. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. No buzzing of phones, no engines outside, no one knocking on the door. I crawled into bed early and listened to the wind outside. I drifted off to sleep easy, but sometime deep in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. There was no sound, no strange lights, but something didn't feel right. You know that sensation, when your body knows something is off before your brain catches up. My ears strained in the darkness. I lay still, barely breathing. Then I heard it, faint crunch, like a step on dry leaves. I sat up slowly in bed. My heart thudded a little harder. I told myself it could have been an animal, a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a branch falling. I got up, crept to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. Nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the moonlight. I stared for a long time. Then, just as I was about to let the curtain drop, I saw something. A figure, not close but not far either. Maybe 30 or 40 feet from the cabin, standing between the trees, not moving. I froze. My first instinct was to duck away from the window. I did it quietly, pulling back into the shadows. My mind raced. Was it someone from the area? A hunter? But who stands in the woods like that at 2 in the morning? I waited, barely blinking. After a few minutes, I peeked again. Gone. Nothing but the trees again. I stayed up the rest of the night, my eyes flicking between the windows. I didn't hear anything else. When the first light of dawn came, I stepped outside, clutching the axe I'd used earlier. I checked the spot where I thought I saw the figure. The ground was scattered with old leaves, but I saw a few spots where the leaves were pushed down, the way they get when someone walks on them. I looked around for a long time, but there were no tracks, just those flattened patches. I tried to shake it off, told myself it could have been a tree or my eyes playing tricks. I hadn't seen it clearly, but I couldn't relax that day. Every sound made me look up. I stopped my walk halfway through and came back early. I left the axe leaning by the door and made sure all the windows were locked before nightfall. I didn't even light the lamps, just stayed in bed in the dark, trying to breathe slow and even. That night, I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. A footprint, there, in the dirt right outside the shed. It was clearly human, long, narrow, The toes splayed slightly. I stared at it for a long time, then checked the door of the shed. It was still locked with the padlock, but I noticed something else. Scratches. Around the metal latch, deep ones, as if someone had taken something sharp and tried to pry it open. I checked all around the cabin. Found more prints. Some faded, some fresh. They circled the cabin in wide loops, some even coming right up to the wall beneath the windows. It wasn't a hunter. Hunters don't walk barefoot, and they don't circle cabins in the middle of the night. I should have left right then, but part of me didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe it was just a prank, or a drifter. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave the next morning. That night, I didn't even get into bed. I sat in the chair near the stove, the axe on my lap, the fire burning low. Every so often, I stood and checked the windows. Around midnight, I heard it again. A scrape, right outside the window. I moved quick and quiet, crouched low, peered through the corner of the curtain. There he was. This time I saw him clearly. He was crouched down by the wall of the cabin, head tilted upward, looking straight at the window I was behind. He was shirtless, filthy. His hair hung in thick, greasy ropes, and his ribs stuck out like he hadn't eaten in days. His hands were pressed flat against the wall, and I saw something long and thin in one of them. A knife, or maybe a chisel. Couldn't tell. I backed away slowly. My legs felt like jelly. He didn't move. I stayed there, crouched, the axe gripped tight in both hands. After maybe 10 minutes, I peeked again. Gone. But now I was done waiting. I shoved everything into my bag, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap. My breath came in quick clouds. I scanned the woods with a flashlight, then ran to the truck. That's when I realized. The wires under the hood were cut. Clean. Straight through. I just stood there for a second. Frozen. No cell service. No way out. 20 miles to the nearest main road. And someone out there with a blade watching. I grabbed my pack and ran back into the cabin. Slammed the door, pushed the table and chairs in front of it. I yanked open the drawers, looking for something. Rope, nails, anything I could use to secure the place. Found a rusted hammer and some thick iron nails in the shed earlier that week. I used them to bar the shutters closed. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, axe in hand, jumping at every creak. By dawn, I was shaking from exhaustion. But then something shifted. The air felt different. I stepped outside with the axe and walked the perimeter, and found something I still can't explain. A bundle, wrapped in what looked like old flannel, tied with twine, sitting on the cabin's front step. I poked it with the axe. Inside, a dead squirrel, gutted, his head missing, the body stuffed with pine needles. I backed away slowly. No more second chances. No more waiting. I grabbed what I could carry and started walking. I followed the dirt road on foot for hours, checking behind me every few minutes. Every crack of a branch made me spin around. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station near the highway. I told them someone had been stalking me, that I had found prints, seen someone. They sent a couple of guys up to the cabin. They didn't find him, but they did find something in the shed. A mattress, moldy, hidden beneath some boards, with old food wrappers nearby, and a bucket. It looked like someone had been living in there on and off, maybe for months, maybe years. The cabin wasn't abandoned. Not really. I never went back. I still don't sleep well in silence. Not anymore. I was never the kind of person who liked crowds. Loud cities drained me. Constant notifications, emails, meetings, people walking too close. Everything about modern life just wore me down. That's why I'd been planning this cabin trip for months. Not a luxury Airbnb. Not a touristy cabin retreat with Wi-Fi and hot tubs. I wanted silence. I wanted to be cut off. I found this place deep in northern Minnesota, miles off the nearest two-lane road, sitting on the edge of a frozen lake that probably hadn't seen a boat in 10 years. The guy I rented it from didn't ask many questions. Just sent me a code for the lockbox and directions that didn't show up on GPS. It wasn't listed anywhere except an old forum about primitive living. He said it had a wood stove, solar battery for a few lights, and a hand pump for water. I brought everything else. I loaded my car with a week's worth of food, tools, firewood, and basic gear. I planned to write, cook simple meals, read, hike, and just disappear for a while. The last 30 miles getting there felt like I was slipping into another time. My cell service dropped around the second gas station past Ely. After that, the road got worse, gravel, potholes, then narrow dirt trails winding through thick pine forest. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches off the road. The trees leaned in close, and I remember thinking how even in daylight, the woods seemed heavy, almost claustrophobic. When I finally saw the clearing, it felt like a breath. The trees opened up to reveal a flat patch of snow-covered ground with the cabin sitting in the middle. It was small, just one story, a steep green metal roof, and with siding that had gone gray with age. A single window faced the clearing, and I could just make out the frozen lake beyond it. The place looked untouched, which was exactly what I wanted. Inside was better than expected. Cold as hell, but dry and solid. The main room had a small table, a couple of chairs, the wood stove in the corner, and a narrow cot along one wall. The bed frame looked handmade. In the back was a cramped kitchen with a pump sink and shelves stocked with a few pans and utensils. The outhouse was maybe 50 feet out behind the cabin. I lit a fire right away. It took time to get the stove warm, but once it caught, the cabin held heat surprisingly well. I unpacked, settled in, and by evening, I was sitting in my long johns reading a book while the wind pushed softly against the windows. No buzzing phones, no voices, just trees and snow and silence. The first day or two passed peacefully. I cooked eggs and canned beans on a camp stove, hiked along the tree line near the lake, and chopped firewood to keep busy. I'd wake up around sunrise, stoke the stove, boil water for instant coffee, then walk a little trail that wrapped around the lake's edge. I didn't see any other houses or trails, just animal tracks and trees. On the third night, I noticed something odd. I'd gone to bed around 10 p.m., belly full from a can of chili, when I woke to a soft crunch outside the window. It wasn't loud, just a slow, deliberate footstep in snow. I thought maybe a deer had wandered close. That wasn't strange in itself. What was strange was that it stopped and didn't move again. No rustling, no fading away, just stopped. I laid there under the heavy quilt, listening. The fire had gone low, and the cabin was quiet, almost painfully quiet. I waited. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. I got up finally, pulled on my boots and jacket, and opened the front door to check. Cold air rushed in. I stepped out into the moonlight. The snow was hard-packed, reflecting pale light that made everything look washed out. There were prints, fresh ones, a single set, leading out of the tree line toward the cabin and stopping about 10 feet from the window. They were boot prints, not animal, deep, wide, with clear tread marks. They hadn't been there during my evening walk. They weren't mine. I followed them back with my eyes, but they disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked again. The prints were still there, just one pair. No return trail. Whoever it was came out of the trees, stood there, and either walked backward into the woods or just vanished. I knew how stupid that sounded. My brain offered logical explanations. Maybe they came at a diagonal and their tracks got covered. Maybe wind filled in the return path. But there hadn't been any wind, and the snow was too fresh for tracks to just fade like that. Still, I tried to shake it off. I told myself maybe it was a hunter or a trapper passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin and wanted to see who was there, then left. But why no knock? Why not call out? Why just stand there? That day, I hiked further out than usual. I took my fixed blade knife and a backpack with snacks and water and followed a deer trail eastward along the lake. Felt good to move. I tried not to keep looking over my shoulder. It was just nerves. Nothing had happened. About a mile out, I noticed something strange in the snow. Another set of boot prints, partially frozen over but still visible, led down from the higher trees toward the lake, then looped back up. Same tread pattern as the ones near the cabin. I followed them for a while, but they faded out on a rocky patch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, so I turned back before the sun dropped too low. That night, I kept the fire roaring. I pushed the small table against the door, not because I thought it would help much, but because it made me feel like I was doing something. I left the hatchet beside the bed. I didn't hear anything, but I didn't sleep either. On the 5th day, I found the cameras. I was chopping kindling out behind the cabin when I saw the glint of glass in the trees. At first, I thought it was just ice on a branch, but it caught the light too perfectly. I walked over and found a trail camera strapped to a pine tree about 10 feet off the ground. It was covered in camo tape, pointing directly at the back of the cabin. Fresh batteries. It looked new. I followed the trees and found 2 more. One at the edge of the outhouse path, another down by the lake pointing toward where I often walked. None of them were mine. I hadn't noticed them before. They were well hidden. I yanked the memory cards from each one and brought them inside. I didn't have a laptop, but I had a trail camera reader that worked on a little battery-powered screen I used for my own camera traps. I popped in the card from the one behind the cabin first. The first few shots were of me carrying firewood, then me walking to the outhouse, then a man, just standing there, wearing heavy boots, camo pants, a dark brown jacket, and a black beanie. The camera had captured him in the early morning light 2 days ago. He stood at the tree line, hands in his pockets, staring toward the cabin. His face wasn't visible, just shadow under the hat, but his posture was stiff. Still, watching. The other 2 cards had similar shots. One showed him walking along the lake, following my trail. Another showed him crouching near the woodpile at night. None of them showed him leaving. That was when something in my head flipped. Up until then, I'd been scared, but I'd convinced myself it was just someone passing through. Maybe even the landowner checking on the place. But these cameras, these weren't casual. They were set up deliberately. Someone had placed them to monitor the cabin, to watch me, someone who had been here long before I arrived. I packed immediately. Food, gear, sleeping bag. I threw everything into the duffel, loaded it in the car, and got ready to leave. But the road out wasn't something I could just speed down. It was narrow, rough, and lined with trees that could hide anything. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to wait for daylight, but I didn't feel safe inside anymore. As I stood there, debating, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything else had so far. Footprints. Fresh ones. Right by the car. Not mine. I followed them slowly. They came from the woods and circled the car. Then they led to the front door of the cabin, then back out toward the lake. I hadn't heard anything. I'd only been inside for 20 minutes, checking the camera cards. But someone had come that close, silently. I didn't wait. I jumped in the car and started the engine. The tires spun on the packed snow, then caught. I drove down the trail, checking my rear view every 5 seconds. Every turn felt like an ambush waiting to happen. I kept expecting a truck to block the road, but nothing came. It took 2 hours to get back to the main highway. When I saw another car for the first time in 5 days, I almost cried. I drove straight to the nearest town, found a diner, and sat inside just staring at people. Everything felt surreal. The noise, the lights, the safety. Later that day, I contacted the sheriff in the nearest county. I gave them the GPS coordinates, told them about the cameras, the man, the footprints. They took it seriously, more than I expected. The deputy I spoke to said there had been complaints from hikers in that area before. Strange encounters, disappearances, but nothing ever confirmed. They sent someone out, but I never heard what they found. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. What stayed with me even more. I was 34 when I rented that cabin. I had just quit a job I hated and was trying to start something new. I had savings, not a lot, but enough to live off for a few months. I wanted peace, quiet, and isolation so I could focus on building a freelance design portfolio. City life had drained me. I was tired of noise, people, sirens, traffic, crowded buildings, even small talk. I just wanted to be alone, completely alone. A friend had told me about a cabin he once stayed in years ago. It was deep in the northern woods, not far from a lake, and nobody lived nearby for miles. The place had no internet, no cell signal, no TV. Just power, heat, water, and quiet. That was all I needed. I booked it for 6 weeks, early spring to mid-May. The weather up there was still chilly at times, especially at night, but manageable. I packed up my car with all the essentials: food, canned goods, dry snacks, bottled water, a few changes of clothes, my laptop, drawing tablet, some books, and basic tools like a flashlight, rope, tarp, and a foldable shovel. I had a small camping stove, even though the cabin had a wood-burning stove and a 2-burner range. I thought I was prepared for anything. The drive took over 8 hours. The last 2 were through forest roads, gravel and dirt, with not a single gas station or house in sight. I only passed 2 trucks the whole way in. The road was rough, and my tires kicked up clouds of dust and pebbles that rattled underneath. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just like I imagined. Wooden structure, 1 story, a small deck out front, 1 window on each side, and a big chimney sticking out the top. The lake was visible through the trees, maybe a 5-minute walk down a narrow path. There was a rusted-out pickup truck off to the side, dead and stripped of its engine. Probably had been there for decades. Inside was basic but cozy. 1 main room with a bed on one side, a small table near the window, a worn-out armchair in the corner, and the wood-burning stove dead center. Kitchenette area had a sink, 2 burners, a fridge, and shelves with old pans and utensils. The bathroom had a toilet and a basic shower, water heated by a small propane heater out back. There was a storage closet with some tools, firewood stacked inside, and some old gear, broken fishing rods, rope, oil lamps, and a battered axe. First, I loved it. Every morning I woke to silence. No car horns, no people yelling, no garbage trucks. Just birds, wind, and the occasional creak of the trees. I started my days by making coffee on the stove and going for a walk down to the lake. The air felt clean. The water was still and cold. I saw animal tracks near the shore. Mostly deer, some raccoons, maybe a fox. I spent hours each day working on my designs and drawings. My laptop had enough battery for several hours, and I had a solar charger for sunny days. I stayed organized, rationed food, chopped wood when needed, and marked each day off on a notepad. Life felt simple, almost perfect, but the quiet started getting too quiet after the first week. I noticed things more, little things, sounds I couldn't place, like thumps on the roof at night but not in a storm, or the sense that something had been moved slightly, like a chair not in the same place I left it. I tried to explain it away. Wind, mice, maybe I was just stressed. I brushed it off. Then one morning I found boot prints outside the front door. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth. Too large to be mine and deeper. I hadn't seen anyone in over a week. The prints led from the woods to the porch, then disappeared around the side. I followed them but lost them near the tree line. I stood still for a long time, listening. Nothing. I told myself it could have been old prints made before I arrived, but they were too clear for that. I started keeping the axe inside at night. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft taps, like something brushing against the window. I stayed under the blanket, holding the flashlight, listening. When I finally got up and peeked outside, nothing was there, just black trees and shadows. I checked the doors, locked. I checked the back of the cabin. Nothing. Still, I barely slept an hour. Over the next few days, I became more alert. I stopped using headphones while I worked. I set up noise traps outside, small tin cans tied with string, placed near the steps. I even blocked the back window with firewood. I started taking the axe with me down to the lake. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was, but it didn't feel like it. Things got worse. One morning I woke up and the front door was wide open. I always locked it. Always. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing stolen, nothing moved. Just wide open. I felt sick. I checked everything. Food, tools, laptop, all untouched. I started thinking maybe I had sleepwalked. Maybe stress was getting to me, but I'd never sleepwalked before in my life. After that, I started sleeping in shifts. An hour here, 2 hours there. Never deeply. I made sure to wedge a chair under the door handle at night. I even tied a rope from the knob to my wrist while I slept. My routine fell apart. I stopped working. I barely ate. I stopped going to the lake. I felt like I was being watched all the time, even inside. I started noticing more footprints. New ones. They circled the cabin, deeper, more erratic. Once, I found what looked like a broken shoelace near the tree line. Another time, I saw a crushed cigarette near the back steps. I don't smoke. Nobody else was supposed to be out here. 3 weeks in, I found something that nearly made me leave right then. Behind the cabin, maybe 20 feet into the woods, I found a tree with deep scratches carved into it. Not from an animal. They were symbols. Straight lines, crude shapes, almost like tally marks. Old ones and new ones. Some faded, others fresh. Nearby, hidden under a pile of sticks, I found an empty can of beans and a torn flannel sleeve. Someone had been out here, maybe still was. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with the axe across my lap, flashlight in my hand, back against the wall. I kept imagining things. Eyes at the window, steps on the porch, breathing near the wall. Every sound made me jump. The wind through the trees, the creak of old wood, even the crackling of the stove. My own heartbeat sounded loud in my ears. I told myself I'd leave the next morning. I had 3 more weeks left, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. I packed everything that night. Folded clothes, wrapped up cables, sealed the food I could carry. I didn't sleep, just waited for dawn. But when I stepped outside early that morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the hood of my car was a single muddy handprint. It was large, fresh, centered on the windshield like someone had leaned in to look inside. There were no footprints near the car. The dew on the ground was undisturbed. It was like they had floated to it, or waited for me to come out. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't care if I left food behind or supplies. I didn't care if I lost the deposit on the cabin. I just wanted to leave. I drove without stopping for hours, checking the rearview mirror constantly. Every time a tree moved, I flinched. Every bend in the road, every rustle in the grass, I thought someone would step out. When I got back to town, I went straight to a motel and stayed there for 2 nights. I didn't go home. I didn't call anyone. I just sat with the curtains closed, trying to make sense of what happened. I never reported it. To who? The police wouldn't do anything. I had no proof, no names. Just a bunch of weird signs and a gut feeling that something was very wrong. I've never gone back to that cabin. I never asked my friend about it again. I didn't even tell him what happened. I tried to move on, but I've changed. I don't like being alone anymore. I keep lights on at night. I check locks multiple times. I avoid trips to quiet places. Something about those woods, about the silence, about knowing that someone was out there the whole time, watching, walking, waiting, that feeling hasn't left me. I still don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. I don't even know how long they had been watching me before I noticed. Maybe from day one, maybe longer. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in that cabin. Not ever. It started when I booked a cabin deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was burnt out. Life in the city had drained something out of me. I worked in insurance claims, endless paperwork, long calls, upset people. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't eating right. I needed time to just breathe. So I looked for somewhere remote. Not a hotel, not a campground with people walking around. I wanted a place where I wouldn't hear another voice or see another face. I found a listing online that looked like it barely existed. 3 photos of a wooden cabin in the woods, 1 paragraph, and a daily rate that seemed too cheap. But it was far enough from anything and everything, so I booked it for 10 days. I drove up in the middle of October. The air was already sharp, and leaves were in their final stage. Most of them fallen, wet, browning on the forest floor. The road leading to the cabin turned from paved to gravel, then to dirt, then barely even that. For the last few miles, I was crawling over uneven terrain that tossed the car side to side. I remember thinking I was going to lose signal soon, so I downloaded the directions and left my phone alone. I didn't need it. That was the whole point. When I reached the cabin, It looked almost exactly like the pictures. Small, single-story, with a green metal roof and wide wooden deck out front. No one greeted me, no lights. I parked, grabbed my bag, and unlocked the front door with a key I got from a lockbox. The inside was even more basic. A small couch with stove, tiny kitchen with a gas-powered fridge and stove, a short hallway leading to a bathroom and single bedroom. It had that faint, musty smell of places left unused for long stretches of time. I didn't mind. That's what I came for. The first night, I made instant noodles and sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. No cars, no voices, just wind and some branches creaking. It was perfect. The next day, I explored around the property. It wasn't fenced, but the cabin was on a hill, and from the back you could walk down into a shallow valley. There were some old trails back there, barely visible under layers of dead leaves. I followed a few, not straying too far. It was quiet, so quiet that when I stopped walking, I could hear the blood in my ears. After a few hours, I headed back, made a small fire in the pit out back, cooked some eggs and toast, and went to bed early. The third day, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the hallway floor. I was coming out of the bathroom when I caught sight of a wooden handle flush with the floorboards. I don't know how I hadn't seen it before. Maybe because a rug had been over it, or maybe I just hadn't been looking. But there it was, a square cutout like a cellar door. I knelt down and lifted it. It was heavier than I expected, made of thick wood. Underneath, there was a short set of wooden stairs, maybe 5 or 6 steps, leading into darkness. I could barely see anything down there. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, and came back. I stood at the top of the stairs, shining the light into the basement. It was a small space, maybe 15 by 15 feet, with stone walls and a concrete floor. There was nothing down there, no shelves, no furniture, no tools. Just a few scattered pieces of wood and an old drain in the middle of the floor. It looked unfinished but dry. I figured it was just a root cellar or something. I didn't go down. I closed the door and forgot about it. But that night, something woke me up. I don't know what it was exactly. Maybe a noise, maybe a feeling. I sat up in bed and listened. I couldn't hear anything at first, just the wind again. Then I heard it, a very faint sound like something tapping, not loud, not constant, just tap, tap, pause, tap. I thought maybe something was hitting the roof or a branch was moving in the wind. I got up and walked slowly through the cabin. Everything looked normal, but when I reached the hallway, I stopped. The rug was pulled halfway back, and the basement door was open. I stood there for a long time. The door hadn't been open when I went to bed. I was sure of that. I always checked everything before I slept, and I had definitely shut it. I reached down, closed it again slowly, and pulled the rug back into place. I didn't go back to sleep for a while. I sat on the couch in my hoodie and socks, staring at the hallway like it might open again. The next morning, I told myself it had just slipped open. Maybe I hadn't latched it. Maybe the old wood had shifted. I went for a walk to clear my head, trying to brush off the unease. But for the rest of the day, I kept thinking about that basement. On the 5th day, I went down. I brought the flashlight again, put on boots, and opened the trapdoor wide. The stairs creaked under my weight. The air down there was cold, and there was a damp, earthy smell. I walked slowly around the space. My light caught little things I hadn't seen before. Faint marks on the wall, like someone had drawn something with chalk and rubbed it off. A small pile of nails in one corner. Some dark stains near the drain, old and dried. There was nothing clearly dangerous or strange, but the feeling I got standing there made my skin tighten. I didn't want to be down there any longer than I had to. I went back up, closed the door again, and tried not to think about it. But that night, I woke up again. This time to a louder noise, like something scraping wood. I got out of bed fast and moved down the hallway. The basement door was open again. Even though I had shut it and put a heavy boot on top of it earlier, the boot had been pushed aside. The trapdoor stood wide open. I leaned over it with the flashlight. The beam shone down into the basement. The stairs were empty. The floor was still, but I didn't feel alone. I shut the door hard, shoved the boot back on top of it, and pushed the rug over it again. That night, I stayed awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a knife I'd found in a drawer. I wasn't thinking straight. I started wondering if someone else was in the woods, if someone had been using that basement. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The dew was thick. I found a spot behind the cabin where the grass had been flattened, like someone had been standing there. I found scuffed dirt near the back steps, not like animal prints, more like shoes. It made my heart pound. I decided to set up a trap. I took an old metal can from the pantry, filled it with coins, and balanced it on the basement door under the rug. If the door opened again, the can would fall and make noise. That night, I waited. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the crash. I jumped up, hard in my throat. The can had fallen. I ran to the hallway. The rug was pushed back again. The trapdoor was open. This time, I saw movement. It wasn't much, just a shadow pulling away from the light, disappearing back down the steps. I didn't move. I stood frozen for what felt like an hour. Then I slowly shut the door, not saying a word, not even breathing loud. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. To first light, I packed my bag. I loaded my gear into the car. I left food behind. I left the firewood. I left everything I didn't need. But before I drove off, I walked back into the cabin one last time. I don't know why. Maybe part of me needed to be sure it wasn't in my head. I opened the basement door in daylight, flashlight in one hand, heavy crowbar in the other. I went down the stairs slowly. Nothing moved. I swept the light across the room. The drain looked darker. When I got close, I saw that it wasn't just stained. It was open. The metal grate was loose, like it had been lifted and set aside. I knelt down and shined the light inside. There was a tunnel. A small, round tunnel about 3 feet wide going down at a steep angle. It was cut through earth and rock, jagged, not man-made, more like someone had clawed or scraped their way through it. It was too narrow for anyone large, but it went down a long way. I couldn't see the end. And just inside the entrance, I saw something, a torn strip of dark cloth, maybe from a coat or jeans. Next to it, a small wooden carving. Looked like a face, but melted or deformed, like it had been burned or chewed. I didn't touch anything. I backed up the stairs, closed the door, and nailed it shut from the top with every nail I could find in the cabin. Then I left and didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town. Didn't stop until I found a gas station. I told the clerk there that I'd found something weird at a rental cabin. He gave me a blank look. I didn't explain more. I didn't file a report. I just drove home. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it. Who made that tunnel? Was someone living in the basement? Was it some kind of animal? Person? Why did they never come up while I was awake? Or had they? And I just didn't know? I checked the listing again a few days later. It was gone. No trace of it. Not even a cached version of the page. I called the rental site. They had no record of that property. No emails. No transaction. It was like it had never existed. To this day, I don't know what I walked away from. I don't go camping anymore. I don't stay in isolated cabins. I don't care how peaceful they are. I had taken 2 weeks off work, the first real time off I'd given myself in over 3 years. I needed it. I felt burned out, not just physically, but mentally. I didn't want to spend my days off in the city either, surrounded by traffic, constant noise, and fluorescent lights. I needed the opposite: quiet, stillness, and space to breathe. I found a small rental cabin online, about 4 hours north of the city, tucked deep in the woods of a national forest. It looked perfect. A basic one-room log cabin with stove for heat, no Wi-Fi, no TV, just electricity and a pump well out back. There was no one else around for miles, just a gravel lot to park my truck, a narrow dirt road to get there, and the sound of wind through trees. That was the kind of quiet I needed. I packed everything I thought I'd need: 2 weeks worth of food, bottled water, my hiking boots, a heavy flashlight, books, tools, and basic gear. I even brought an old hunting rifle that belonged to my grandfather, just in case of wild animals. I didn't expect to use it. The drive up was quiet and mostly uneventful. The deeper I got into the forest, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned off onto a gravel road that narrowed until it was basically a path. It twisted and dipped through trees and brush, then finally opened up to a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was just like the pictures, plain and square with a slanted roof and a little porch. There was a gravel lot next to it where I parked my truck. No other cabins in sight. No signs of people. I got there in the late afternoon, and the sun was starting to sink low behind the hills. The air was cool, smelled like damp earth and pine needles. I stepped out of my truck and just stood there for a while, listening. There wasn't a sound besides the wind in the trees and the creak of the truck cooling down. Felt good, real good. I unloaded everything and took it inside. The cabin was one open room, bed in the corner, a table, small kitchenette with a propane stove, wood stove in the middle, and a small bathroom in the back with a composting toilet. I started a fire in the stove right away because it was already dropping cold. I ate a cold sandwich I had packed and unpacked the rest of my gear while the place warmed up. That first night, I slept harder than I had in months. No sirens outside my window, no phone buzzing, just the sound of the wind and the crack of the fire. The first couple days went exactly how I hoped. I hiked for miles each morning. The forest felt endless. Trails twisted around lakes and climbed through ridges thick with moss and leaves. I saw deer. Once, a black bear in the distance that didn't notice me. I cooked simple meals and read for hours. I kept my phone turned off in a drawer. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. It was like I had the entire forest to myself. On the fourth day, things changed. I had just gotten back from a long hike, maybe 6 hours out. I was dirty, hungry, and my legs ached. I dropped my pack on the porch, opened the door, and immediately froze. There was mud on the floor, long, wet boot prints, fresh, not mine. I knew I hadn't left the door unlocked, but I checked it now and sure enough, it was still locked. I backed out onto the porch and looked around, my eyes scanning the trees, the gravel lot. Nothing. The sky was already starting to dim, and shadows were long. I didn't go inside right away. I walked around the entire cabin slowly, heart thudding in my chest. I didn't see anyone. No vehicles in the lot but mine. I even walked 100 yards into the woods in every direction but saw nothing. No sounds, no movement. When I finally went back inside, I checked everything. Nothing had been taken. Nothing out of place except the mud prints. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't stop thinking about it either. I washed the prints away, but I kept looking at the door, testing the lock over and over. That night, I barely slept. I told myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I tracked the mud in and just didn't remember. Maybe the prints looked longer than they were. Maybe I was tired. The next day, I took a shorter hike. My mind wasn't on the trail. I kept turning around, scanning behind me, listening. When I got back that afternoon, I circled the cabin before going in. Nothing seemed off. I opened the door slowly. No mud this time, but the dish towel I'd left folded on the table was on the floor. Again, nothing was missing, nothing broken, just off. I sat down on the edge of the bed and felt cold despite the stove burning. I didn't like how this was going. The next morning, I drove into the nearest small town, maybe 30 miles out. I bought a set of cheap door alarms and a motion light for the porch. It took half the day to install them back at the cabin, but I felt better, safer. That night, as the wind picked up outside and rain began falling, I lay awake staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Around 2 a.m., the porch light flicked on. I sat up in bed, every hair on my body standing. I didn't move. I just stared at the cabin door, which was locked, bolted, and now shining faintly from the outside light coming through the small window. Then the door alarm went off with a high-pitched shriek. I grabbed my flashlight in one hand and my grandfather's rifle in the other and moved slowly to the door. I stayed to the side and looked through the window, heart hammering so loud I felt it in my throat. There was no one there. The light stayed on for maybe 30 more seconds, then shut off. I opened the door slowly, stepped onto the porch. The rain had turned everything slick. The gravel lot was shiny under the light. I aimed the flashlight across the clearing. That's when I saw them. Wet boot prints, fresh again, leading away from the porch across the gravel lot and disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't. Something in me resisted the idea of being chased away. I told myself maybe it was a hiker, maybe they got lost, maybe they thought this cabin was a ranger's post or something. Maybe they saw the light and figured someone was there and backed off. But none of that explained the dish towel, the locked door, the feeling that someone had been inside. The 6th day it rained again all morning. I stayed close to the cabin and chopped wood, tried to stay occupied. Around noon, I decided to check the gravel lot more closely. I had an idea to rake it smooth, just to see if anyone walked through again. I didn't have a rake, so I used a big branch and dragged it across the gravel until I cleared away the old footprints and tire tracks. The lot was maybe 40 feet across, and I smoothed every inch. I even took pictures afterward, just in case. That night, no alarms went off. The motion light stayed dark. In the morning, I walked out with my coffee and stared at the gravel. There were footprints again. One pair. They came from the woods, walked across the gravel to the porch, then turned and walked back. I couldn't see them clearly in the gravel, but they were there. I could see the toe imprints where the person had turned around, the deeper press of a boot heel as they stepped back toward the trees. The strangest part? The stride. The footprints were spaced wide apart, too wide for someone walking slow or sneaking. They looked like someone running. I stood out there for a long time just staring at them. I tried to follow them into the woods, but they disappeared about 20 feet in, lost in the leaves and mud. I didn't bother hiking that day. I kept the rifle nearby, loaded. I triple-checked the locks, added nails to the inside of the door frame. I moved the small table in front of the door at night, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. Couldn't relax. The next 3 days were the worst. The lights kept triggering. The alarms too. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there. Just the forest and the lot and darkness. I stopped going outside at night completely. I barely slept. My food started to run low because I hadn't been out to the truck to grab more supplies from the cooler in the bed. I didn't want to be out there in the open. On the 10th day, I made a plan to leave early the next morning. I couldn't take the stress anymore. I missed the city. I missed traffic and people and sirens. I missed knowing that if something happened, someone would hear me scream. That night, I went to bed early. I had packed everything already. All I needed to do was load the truck and go. At 3:12 a.m., the power went out. The cabin went pitch black. The motion light, the alarms, everything dead. I sat up instantly. The fire had gone low. I grabbed the flashlight, clicked it on. The beam flickered, then went out. Batteries were dead. I reached for my phone. It had 2% battery. I turned on the screen. The only light in the cabin came from that faint blue glow. I opened the flashlight app. Weak light spilled across the floor. Then I heard it. Boots. Slow, steady. On the gravel outside. Then the porch creaked. Then a hand tried the doorknob. I froze. I didn't breathe. I held the phone tight in one hand and reached for the rifle with the other. I decided to spend a week in a remote cabin deep in the mountains. I needed time away from everything. The constant noise, phone calls, work messages, notifications, traffic, and people. I just wanted silence. I wanted to be alone for a while. I had started getting headaches that wouldn't go away. I wasn't sleeping much. I had gotten tired of people. I started thinking maybe I just needed nature, trees, dirt, wind, quiet. So I booked a cabin I found online. It wasn't a fancy vacation rental. It was old and basic. It didn't even have Wi-Fi, no TV, just a small fireplace, a bed, a bathroom, and a kitchen that barely worked. I found it through some weird website with outdoor listings. It was listed as off-grid, and the photos looked like someone had just walked into the forest and built a box out of wood. But it looked peaceful. That's all I wanted. The drive up there was long. It took me about 7 hours, and the last part was a rough dirt road that climbed steeply through forest. It was rocky and narrow, and at some point I started to think maybe my car wouldn't make it. But I kept going. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low. The place was surrounded by tall trees. No other house in sight. No cell signal. There was a small clearing around the cabin, and behind it, the woods just stretched out endlessly. No fences, no roads, no signs. It was quiet. The cabin itself was smaller than I thought, maybe 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. The wood was weathered. Some of the planks were cracked. The door creaked loudly when I opened it. Inside, there was a faint smell, old wood, dust, and something like damp fabric. The floor was uneven. There was one main room with a bed in the corner, a wood stove, a tiny table, and a sink that ran cold water from a tank outside. There was also a smaller side room that had shelves with some basic tools and camping stuff. Matches, oil lamps, canned food, duct tape, rope, and a hunting knife that had been left behind. Everything was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just a heavy stillness. I dropped my bag on the bed and stepped back outside. I stood in the clearing and looked around. The air smelled clean. Trees were everywhere, all around, stretching far into the hills. Felt like the world had stopped moving. The first night was fine. I cooked something simple on a small propane stove I had brought. I ate outside. I listened to the sounds of the forest. Nothing but the occasional snap of a twig far off. The stars came out early, and there were more than I had seen in years. It was beautiful. I felt calm. I felt like I had made the right choice. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next day, I woke up to the sound of birds. Light came in through the small window. I stretched and got out of bed. I made coffee and sat on the front steps. The whole place felt peaceful. I took a walk through the woods later. I didn't go far, just followed a path downhill that led to a dry creek bed. I saw deer tracks in the dirt, some broken branches. I picked up a few odd rocks and sat on a fallen tree for a while, just listening. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that felt off. The door was slightly open. I was sure I had pulled it shut. It didn't have a lock, but I had wedged a small wooden stick in the doorframe from inside when I left. That stick was now lying on the floor. I checked around. Nothing was missing. My bag was still on the bed. My food was untouched. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the door just didn't stay closed well. Still, I felt a little uneasy. I pushed it out of my mind. That night, I lit the oil lamp early. I kept it beside the bed while I read a paperback book. I didn't want to use my phone. I had it turned off. The only thing I used it for was the flashlight sometimes. I fell asleep again without much trouble. But around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up. There was no noise, but I felt something. A stillness that wasn't right. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The oil lamp was out. The cabin was pitch dark. I couldn't see anything at all. I reached over to the side of the bed for my flashlight, turned it on, and swept it across the room. Nothing, just old wood and shadows. Still, the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I stood up slowly and checked the door. It was closed, but the stick I had wedged was gone. I found it on the floor again. I knew I had put it there before I went to sleep. I was certain. I didn't hear any wind that night. No sounds at all. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to look for footprints. I found something strange behind the cabin, near the tank. The dirt was soft there. There was a mark, a narrow line that curved along the ground. It didn't look like a shoe print, more like something had been dragged slowly. It wasn't deep, but it was noticeable. I followed it for a few feet, then it disappeared into the grass. Maybe it was a branch or a stick that had been pulled by an animal. Still, it bothered me. By the third night, I started hearing sounds. They weren't loud, mostly soft cracks in the woods. Once, just after midnight, I heard what sounded like a shuffle of feet near the window. I froze. I sat up in bed and didn't move. The sound didn't come back. I stayed awake for hours, listening. My heart wouldn't slow down. In the morning, I checked again. No tracks, no signs of anything, but the side room's small window had dirt smudges on the outside, like someone had touched it. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, a bear maybe, but the smudges looked like fingers, thin, long ones. I started keeping the hunting knife near my bed. By the fourth day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed near the cabin. I felt watched. Every time I stepped outside, I had the urge to look behind me. The woods looked different. Still the same trees, but the feeling had changed. I couldn't explain it. Like something was wrong out there. Something watching from behind the trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. A noise from the back of the cabin. Not a branch. Not the wind. A scrape. Then footsteps. I sat up slowly. My mouth was dry. I held the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. The footsteps were soft but clear. They circled the cabin once, then stopped by the front door. I turned off the light, held my breath, waited. No knock, no sound, nothing, just silence again. I didn't dare move. I stayed like that until the first light came in through the window. When I opened the door at sunrise, I found small piles of rocks, 5 of them, right in front of the steps, arranged in a perfect line. Each stack had exactly 3 stones. I didn't do that. I kicked them over and looked around the trees. Nothing. I shouted into the woods even though I didn't want to. No answer. I packed my things that morning. I wasn't going to stay the full week. I had planned to, but I was done. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. Dead. The battery was fine when I arrived. I checked under the hood. I had no idea what I was looking for. Nothing looked obviously wrong. I tried again. No sound. I had no cell signal. I grabbed my backpack, took a bottle of water, and started walking down the dirt road. I knew it would take hours to get back to anything. The forest was quiet. Every step I took, I felt watched. I kept hearing twigs snap in the trees behind me. After about 2 hours, I stopped to rest. That's when I saw something in the distance. A shape. Someone standing between the trees far behind me. Not moving, just standing. I stared for a long time. The figure didn't move. I turned and kept walking. I didn't stop again. When I finally made it to a paved road, I flagged down a car. An old man driving a pickup stopped. I told him my car was dead up the road, and I had been staying in a cabin. He didn't say much, just drove me to the nearest town. I called a tow truck and got the car pulled back later. The mechanic said someone had pulled out a wire under the hood. Clean cut, not chewed by animals. Whoever it was had done it while I was inside that cabin. It's been months since then. I still think about it. I still remember the feeling. That cabin is still up there. I found it again on the listing site recently. Still available. I reported it. Told the site something was wrong. They never replied. But I know what I felt. Someone was out there. Someone was watching me. And they didn't want me to leave. I was supposed to be up there for 5 days. That's what I told myself when I parked my truck on the slope just before the cabin. I remember sitting there for a while, watching the snow start to fall heavier, hearing it tick against the windshield. The radio was playing something soft, but I turned it off. I just sat there and listened to the nothing outside. The cabin was something I had found online. It wasn't fancy or even that clean from the pictures, but it was far enough out from town to feel like a break. And it had a wood stove and no cell signal, which was what I wanted. No calls, no texts, just time away from everything. I had been dealing with stress from work, family stuff, bills stacking up, and the kind of pressure that makes your chest feel tight even when you're trying to sleep. I needed quiet, just 5 days of it. I killed the engine and stepped out into the cold. The wind pushed the falling snow sideways. It didn't seem too bad yet, but I knew more was coming. Forecast said something like 16 inches overnight. That didn't bother me. I was used to snow. I grew up with it. The cabin sat about 100 yards in from where the truck was parked. The driveway was a steep gravel path, but it hadn't been plowed recently and I wasn't going to risk getting stuck that deep in. I hauled my bag up the hill, my boots crunching through the powder, breath sharp in my lungs, and the only sound around me was the wind pushing through the trees. The trees were thick up there, mostly pine, tall and dark, packed close together so even with snow on them, they looked heavy. The sky above was already turning that pale gray that comes before a snowstorm really sets in. I remember stopping halfway up and turning around to look down the slope. My truck was already getting dusted. The road behind it disappeared into trees and snow. I couldn't see any houses. No signs. No lights. Just trees and white and the wind. That was what I came for. The cabin itself was smaller than I thought it would be. About 25 feet across the front. Maybe 30 deep. Just a small front porch with one step that was sagging in the middle. The wood siding was cracked in a few places, and the roof had patches where the shingles were missing. It didn't matter to me. I wasn't looking for perfect. I just wanted somewhere to stay. I got the key out of the lockbox that was nailed to the doorframe and went in. The inside was dark, even during the day. There were 2 windows, one by the kitchen area and one beside the bed. But they were covered with thick curtains that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. I turned on the light near the door. A single bulb flickered and then held steady. It smelled musty, like wood and old rugs and dust. But not bad. It just smelled and used. The kind of place that only gets visitors a few times a year. I dropped my bag by the bed and walked through the one-room layout. A small stove in the back corner with a woodpile beside it. A tiny sink and counter with a half-fridge and some mismatched cabinets. There was a small table under the window and a chair with a cushion that had stuffing coming out one side. The bed was a low frame with a thick blanket and a few flat pillows. The bathroom was through a narrow door on the right. Just a toilet, a metal sink, and a mirror that had scratches on it. The mirror was so scratched I could barely see my reflection clearly. That's how old and foggy it was. Still, it had running water, and the heat from the wood stove started to warm the place once I got it going. I spent the first few hours unpacking my food, stacking wood inside, and checking everything. The lock on the door worked. Windows latched. Stove burned fine. I had brought enough water jugs, food, batteries, and candles to last a week, just in case. I even brought a small battery-powered radio and a satellite phone, though I kept it off. Only for emergencies. That first night was quiet. I made soup on the little stove, sat by the window while it snowed outside, and just let myself be still for the first time in months. I remember thinking how good it felt not to have anything to check. No emails, no calendar, no texts, just the fire crackling and snow outside. But that night, I started to hear something. It wasn't much, not at first. I had gone to bed around 10. The wind outside had picked up, and the snow was really coming down. The whole cabin would creak sometimes, like the wood was shifting. That was normal. But I heard something else too, a kind of soft thud, like something hitting the wall outside. Once, maybe twice, then nothing. I told myself it was probably snow falling off a tree, maybe a branch, or just the wood creaking in the cold. I pulled the blanket up higher and closed my eyes. It happened again around 2 in the morning. I was half asleep when I heard it. A dull single thud. Not on the roof, not from the stove, on the wall right behind the head of the bed. I sat up and listened. Nothing after that. Just the wind. I waited for 10, maybe 15 minutes. Still nothing. I finally laid back down, but I had that feeling in my chest, like something wasn't right. The next morning, I looked around outside. There were no footprints, no tracks, just snow piled up almost a foot deep. The trees looked the same. The porch had a drift that came up to the top step. I walked all the way around the cabin, just to be sure. Nothing. No marks. No animals. No branches down. Just snow and trees. But that feeling didn't go away. I tried to distract myself. Made breakfast. Read for a while. Chopped a little more wood. I even tried going for a short walk up the ridge behind the cabin. But the snow was too deep, and I hadn't brought snowshoes. I ended up turning around after 20 minutes, windburn stinging my face. When I came back to the cabin, I saw something that didn't make sense. The curtain on the front window had moved. It wasn't drawn all the way like I had left it. It was just slightly parted, just a few inches, like someone had peeked through it and didn't close it fully. I stood outside the door for a while, heart pounding, staring at that tiny opening. I opened the door slowly, stepped inside. The air felt warmer than it should have, like it had been shut for a long time, but someone had just stirred the room. Nothing looked moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had. I checked everything: the bed, the cabinets, under the sink, even opened the bathroom and checked behind the door. Nothing. I told myself I had probably left the curtain like that and just didn't remember. Maybe I had bumped it. Maybe it was the wind when I opened the door earlier. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the fire going, stayed up by it with a book, but I wasn't reading. I was just looking up every time the cabin creaked. And it creaked a lot. Every time the wind hit it, it moaned in the frame. I started to think maybe it was just the storm that made me feel off. The isolation, being out here with no one around. It was messing with my head. That had to be it. But then, around midnight, I heard it again. This time it was a set of 3 thuds, even spaced out, right against the back wall, like someone knocking low to the ground. Not hard, just steady. Then silence. I didn't move for a while, just sat there with the blanket over me, not blinking, heart pounding. I finally got up and walked to the back window, pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing out there. No moon, just snow blowing through the dark. No shapes, no figures, no movement. I turned the stove down, got the flashlight, and waited until morning. When daylight came, I walked back behind the cabin, and this time I saw something. There were scratches on the wall, low to the ground, not big, but clear, like someone had scraped a metal edge across the wood. Not deep enough to gouge it, but fresh. At least 4 or 5 lines, all clustered together. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't there yesterday. I was sure of that. I had checked. I had walked the whole way around. The wood there had been clean. And now there were these long scratches right where the knocks had come from. I didn't know what to do. I thought about packing up, driving back down. But the snow was deep now. The path to the truck was drifted shut. I'd have to dig it out, and I didn't know if the truck would even get traction. Plus, it was early, only day 3. I didn't want to leave over what could just be animals or trees rubbing the cabin. Still, I didn't leave the cabin again that day. I stayed inside, cooked, read, stayed close to the fire. The satellite phone sat on the table, turned off. I told myself I'd only use it if something really happened. That night, it happened again. But this time, it wasn't just knocks. I woke up to the sound of something brushing the window, a soft scraping like a branch, but there were no trees that close to the window. I had checked. There were at least 10 feet between the trees and the cabin walls. I sat up slowly and looked over. The curtain moved, just slightly, just a ripple, but it moved. I didn't go to the window. I sat frozen in bed, not breathing, staring at it. Then I heard it again. Thud, pause. Thud, thud, this time from the side wall. Closer, louder, and this time followed by something dragging across the siding. A long, slow scrape, like nails, like metal. That was the moment I grabbed the... I don't know why I thought I was ready for that kind of solitude. I wasn't. Maybe part of me just wanted to get away from everything, the traffic, the emails, the coworkers, the apartment building noises, and the constant pressure of pretending to care about things I didn't. I guess I thought the mountains would fix that. I'd found the listing buried deep in a hiking forum, an old fire lookout cabin that could be rented for cheap, real cheap. It was up near the Idaho-Montana border, sitting on a remote ridgeline at over 7,000 feet, no cell service, and reachable only by a steep 6-mile hike. The photos looked like something out of a movie: endless pines, a cabin that stood over everything on wooden stilts, and a sky so clear you could see galaxies with your bare eyes. It seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and completely disconnected. I thought it'd be peaceful. I packed up everything I thought I'd need: a propane camp stove, a week's worth of dehydrated food, 2 water filters, a big jug of water, layers of clothes, a med kit, batteries, satellite GPS, solar charger, sleeping bag, bear spray, a hatchet, and my journal. I was proud of my packing. I thought I was ready. The hike in was brutal, though. I underestimated how steep it would be, especially carrying all that weight. The trail was barely maintained, and in some places, it had eroded into a narrow ledge with a sharp drop on one side. I slipped a couple times and scraped my hand on some jagged rock, but I kept going. I told myself that was part of the adventure. The air got thinner as I climbed, and I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. But after a few hours, I made it to the top. When I first saw the cabin in person, I was in awe. It looked just like the pictures, perched on a tall frame of old beams, square-shaped with a wraparound balcony, and windows on all sides. The forest dropped away in every direction. The sun was just beginning to dip behind a mountain ridge, casting golden light across the trees. I climbed the ladder to the cabin, unlocked the door with the code the forum host gave me, and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood and old dust. The walls were lined with maps and charts, and there was a small wood stove in one corner. A tiny cot was pushed against one wall, and a table stood in the middle with a wooden chair beside it. I felt this strange stillness inside, a silence that pressed in on my ears. No hum of electricity, no voices, no engine sounds, just wind and the creaking of wood. At first, it felt kind of magical. I boiled water on the propane stove, made some instant rice and beans, and sat on the balcony to eat while watching the stars come out. They came in fast, sharp, and bright, hundreds of them. I'd never seen anything like it, but the silence became harder to enjoy the longer I sat with it. That first night was colder than I expected. Even with layers and a sleeping bag, I couldn't stay warm. The wind rattled the walls and made this low whistle through the cracks in the window frames. I kept thinking I was hearing footsteps or shifting sounds underneath the floorboards, like something was moving around below the cabin, but I told myself it was probably branches moving or the wood creaking from the wind. I left the propane lamp on all night just to keep some light in the room. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the ridge. There wasn't much of a trail. I bushwhacked through thick pines, stopped often to check the GPS, and got a few good photos of the surrounding landscape. There were no signs of people, no trash, no footprints, just animal tracks, some deer, a few squirrels, and what I thought was a cougar print, wide with sharp claws. The cabin stood out like a tower among the trees when I looked back at it. It felt small from a distance. I didn't realize until that moment how high up it was. Those stilts weren't just tall, they were uneven too. Some of the wood looked warped. I made a note to be careful on the ladder. That evening, I settled in to write and boil more water. The sun dipped faster than I expected. It was like someone flipped a switch and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. That night, the noises under the cabin were louder, not just wind. I was sure of it. Something kept brushing against the beams. Something heavy. A dull thud once, then silence, then another scrape. I stayed up most of the night with the propane lamp on again, gripping the hatchet in one hand under the blanket, trying to stay calm. I thought maybe it was a bear, but I hadn't stored any food outside, and the cabin had no crawl space or open storage underneath, just the stilts. There was no reason for a bear to be poking around down there. By the third day, I started feeling the weight of being that far from everything. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt vulnerable. I had no bars on my GPS device unless I hiked a quarter-mile up the trail to a rocky outcrop. I started doing that in the afternoons just to check the weather. Every time I looked at the cabin from that outcrop, I felt something I couldn't explain, like I was being watched. Not by something inside the cabin, but something watching me with the cabin. As if it didn't belong up there anymore. Like something had claimed it. Later that evening, I noticed a strange footprint in the dirt near the base of the ladder. It wasn't from my boots. It was wider, heavier. The edges were smudged, but the depth told me someone or something had been standing there, staring up at the cabin. No animal I could think of would stand like that. It looked human, just barefoot, maybe. The worst part was, I hadn't heard anything. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was mine from earlier and I stepped weird. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone. That night, I left the lamp off to conserve propane. I thought maybe I was scaring myself with the shadows. But around 1 or 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the ladder creaking. Not once, twice, slowly. There's no mistaking that sound. I'd gone up and down that ladder a dozen times already. I knew the sound. The third creak came, and I sat up slowly, holding my breath. I couldn't see anything through the windows because the moon was blocked by clouds. Total darkness. I didn't want to turn the lamp on right away. I just sat there, gripping the hatchet, heart pounding in my ears. Then I heard it. Something breathing. Not loud, not close, but definitely breathing, somewhere just below the floor. Stayed like that for a while, me frozen in place, that soft breathing sound mixed with the wind. Then it stopped. I never heard footsteps going down, just silence again. I didn't sleep at all after that, just waited for morning, staring at the ladder trapdoor. When the sun finally came up, I rushed outside and checked the base again. No new prints, no tracks, nothing, but I knew what I heard. That day, I hiked to the outcrop and used the GPS to send an "I'm okay" ping, even though I wasn't. I also checked the forecast again. A storm was coming. 2 days of cold rain and high winds. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but I was too tired and the hike down in bad weather could be risky. I convinced myself to stay one more night and decide in the morning. That night, it got worse. I'd secured the trapdoor hatched to the ladder with a bolt and a heavy iron pan I found in a corner. But at 3 a.m., the whole floor shook. Not once, but twice, like something heavy hit one of the stilts. The pan rattled on the wood. I could hear creaking, but not from wind. It was methodical, slow. Something was moving around the base again. Then came the sound of the ladder again. The creaking steps, this time all the way up, one step at a time. Then silence. Then a sound against the trapdoor, like fingertips brushing the wood. That's when I lost it. I turned the lamp on full blast, grabbed the flare from my emergency kit, pulled open the trapdoor, and shouted down into the darkness. Not saying anything, just yelling, just making noise to scare off whatever it was. There was nothing there. But the next morning, I found the flare, the one I'd left inside the cabin, lying at the bottom of the ladder, like someone had been inside, taken it, and left it there for me to find. That was it. I packed everything up as fast as I could. I didn't even finish breakfast. I strapped on my bag, made sure my knife and bear spray were easy to reach, and started the hike back. I didn't look back at the cabin. Not once. I just focused on getting down that mountain. The weather hit faster than expected. Wind howled through the trees and rain came in sideways. I slipped a few times, bruised my thigh on a rock, soaked through to my skin, but I didn't stop. It took me twice as long to get down, but I made it to the trailhead by nightfall. My car was still there, and I almost cried when I saw it. I drove straight into the nearest town and paid for a motel room without even asking the price. I never went back. I've read stories about people seeing things in the woods, about weird sounds or strange disappearances, but I never believed them until then. I still don't think it was anything supernatural. I think it was person, maybe someone who used to live up there, or someone who found it and decided it was theirs. Maybe they live out there permanently. Maybe they just wait for someone to come alone. I don't know. All I know is that place wasn't abandoned, and I'll never go into the woods alone again. I never liked the idea of running away from problems, but by the time last September came around, I felt like I didn't have much of a choice. I was falling apart. Every little thing in my life was crashing into the next. I couldn't think straight, couldn't sleep, couldn't even eat right. I was constantly tense, and I kept snapping at people without meaning to. My chest always felt tight, and my brain was always noisy, like there was a storm inside it. So when my old high school friend emailed me out of the blue saying he had a family cabin up in northern Idaho that I could use for a while, I said yes without thinking too hard. I didn't even ask for details. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet. No phones, no internet, no people. Just space. Space to think, to rest, to reset. He gave me the code to a lockbox that would have the key. He said there was a generator, a big water tank, canned food, and some firewood already stocked. He hadn't been up there in over a year, so he told me to be ready to clean up a bit. I didn't care. I packed everything I thought I'd need and left the next day. The drive up was long. I spent nearly 8 hours behind the wheel, most of it on empty roads that twisted through forests and hills. By the time I reached the final dirt road, The sun was low, and the trees were throwing long shadows over everything. The road was rough, full of dips and ruts, and I had to go slow. My car rattled like it was going to fall apart. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, I just sat in the car for a few minutes, staring. It looked smaller than I expected. It was made of dark wood, almost black from age and weather. The roof was metal, slanted, with pine needles piled up on one side. There was a deck out front with a broken chair and a table that looked warped from years of snow and sun. The trees were thick all around, tall and silent. It felt empty, not spooky or anything like that, just forgotten. I got out and stretched my legs. Everything smelled like damp wood and moss. I could hear nothing but birds and the wind in the trees. I used the code and opened the lockbox. The key was there, just like he said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was musty and dark at first. I had to prop the door open to let in some light. There were cobwebs in the corners, and a thin layer of dust covered everything. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen area, a couch, a wood stove, a table, and a small bathroom with an old toilet and sink. There was a bedroom in the back with a narrow bed and a tiny window. I lit some candles I found in a drawer and started cleaning. It took a couple of hours to wipe things down, shake out blankets, and sweep the floor. I found the generator behind the cabin, checked the fuel, and got it running. It gave me just enough power for a lamp and the tiny fridge. I didn't need much. By the time I sat down on the couch that night, the stars were out, and it was cold. I made some soup from a can and sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, looking out into the woods. It was quiet, exactly what I wanted. The first couple of days were calm. I spent time walking in the woods, reading, and just sitting. No noise, no pressure, no one expecting anything from me. I could feel my shoulders relax a little. I started sleeping better, longer. My thoughts didn't race as much. I ate simple meals, wrote a few things in a notebook, and took naps in the afternoon. It was like my body was trying to reset. But then things started to feel off. It began with small things. The first was when I went out back to check the water tank and noticed fresh footprints near the generator. They weren't mine. They were wider and deeper, big boots. At first, I told myself maybe they were old and had just been preserved by the damp ground. But they looked fresh. The outline was clear, not dried out or washed away. Then I noticed some firewood missing. I had stacked it neatly the day before. I was sure of it. Now it was messier, like someone had taken some from the middle of the pile. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, trying to remember if I had used any more than I thought. But I hadn't touched it. That night, I locked the door and pushed a chair up under the knob. I told myself it was just animals or the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The next day, I went for a longer walk. I followed a trail that ran deeper into the woods behind the cabin. It wasn't a marked trail, just a narrow path where the grass was low and the trees weren't so thick. I walked for nearly an hour and then came across something that made my stomach tighten. It was a tree, and nailed to it was a long strip of cloth. It looked like it had been torn from a shirt. It was old and dirty, sun-bleached and fraying at the edges. But what really got me was the nail. It was fresh, still shiny, with no rust. Whoever put it there hadn't done it long ago. I turned around and walked back fast. I didn't run, but my chest felt tight the whole time. Every branch snap behind me made me jump. When I got back to the cabin, I locked everything again and stayed inside the rest of the day. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking I heard things outside. Soft footsteps, a branch snapping. Once, I was sure I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening. Nothing happened. The next morning, I found something worse. There were marks on the side of the cabin. Near the back window, deep scratches in the wood. Not claw marks. These were straight, like from a knife or a tool. 3 lines, about a foot long each, carved into the wall just below the window. I stood there staring at them, my stomach cold and heavy. I packed my bag that morning. I was done. I didn't care how peaceful it was or how badly I needed space. Something was wrong out there. I loaded up my car and went to start it. It didn't start. I tried again. Nothing, just a soft clicking sound. I opened the hood and looked, though I didn't really know what I was looking for. The battery looked fine, the cables were still connected. But something smelled off. Burnt. Metallic. Like something had shorted out. I stood there staring into the engine bay, the trees quiet all around me, and for the first time since arriving, I felt scared. I went back inside and locked the door. I tried the radio in the cabin. Dead. The generator was still running, but the radio just gave static. I tried every frequency. Nothing. I had no signal on my phone either. I walked a bit up the road, holding the phone in the air, but still nothing. No bars. No GPS. I was stuck. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside. I only went out to get wood and keep the generator fueled. I barely slept. Every night, I heard something outside. Soft steps. Movement. I started keeping a knife on me at all times, just a kitchen knife, but it made me feel a little better. On the third night, it got worse. I was lying in bed, fully dressed, the knife in my hand. The generator had shut off a couple hours earlier, and I hadn't gone out to restart it. It was too dark, and I was too scared. Then I heard it, the back door handle turning. It didn't rattle. It didn't jiggle. It turned slowly, smoothly, like someone was trying it gently. I stopped breathing. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Turned again, then stopped. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I heard footsteps walking away from the cabin, crunching over twigs and pine needles. I waited until sunrise to move. That morning, I found more footprints. Big ones again. They led from the back door to the woods. I followed them a little way, maybe 20 or 30 feet, then stopped. They just vanished, like the person had walked backward, or started walking on something to hide them. Couldn't tell. I went back inside and started boarding the windows with anything I could find. I pushed furniture against the doors. I kept the knife on me at all times. I stopped going outside completely. I started running low on food. I ate less, mostly crackers, dried fruit, old soup. I drank from the water tank and boiled it on the stove. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard something different. A thump from the roof. Then another, like heavy steps. Slow, deliberate. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the ceiling. Then I heard it slide. Something heavy dragging across the metal roof. I stayed in bed, shaking. Couldn't move. I just lay there with the knife clutched in both hands, waiting for the noise to stop. It did after maybe 20 minutes, but I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I climbed out the back window and pulled myself onto the roof to check. There were marks, long, straight grooves in the metal, like someone had dragged something across it. A stick? A pole? I didn't know, but it was real, not in my head. I climbed back down and sat on the floor, shaking. I knew I had to leave. The next day, I took a backpack, stuffed it with food and water, and started walking down the road. I didn't care how far it was to town. I just walked. The trees were too quiet. Every sound made my skin crawl. I walked for 2 hours, maybe 3. That's when I found the tire tracks. They weren't from my car. These were wide. It all started when I decided to take a break from the usual grind of city life. My head had been feeling too heavy from the constant traffic, phones ringing, screens flashing, and just people everywhere all the time. I hadn't taken a proper vacation in almost a year, and I could feel it in my body. I was always tired. My eyes would twitch for no reason, and my heart raced over small things. I wasn't sleeping well either. So, I thought it was time to get out for a while. I didn't want hotels or beach resorts or anything like that. I wanted something quiet, something that didn't have people. Somewhere deep in the woods maybe, where the only sounds would be the wind and birds. After scrolling through a few rental websites, I found this cabin. It wasn't fancy. In fact, it was just a single-story, wooden cabin sitting on an old stretch of land called Dry Pine Ridge. No neighbors, no paved roads leading to it. Just trees, dirt, and a long gravel path. That's exactly what I wanted. The pictures looked fine. A small porch, a chimney, basic furniture, even a wood stove and solar-powered lights. The listing said it was off-grid but functional. I liked the idea of disconnecting, so I booked it for 10 days. The drive out was long. I left early in the morning with a trunk full of food, water, clothes, a camping knife, a couple books, my flashlight, backup batteries, and some emergency supplies just in case. I also brought a first aid kit, bear spray, and an old handheld radio. Cell service dropped off completely about an hour before I reached the cabin, which I expected. I followed the gravel path for about 5 miles through thick pine forest until the trees opened up slightly and the cabin came into view. It was exactly as shown in the pictures, weathered but standing solid, a little crooked in places, with dry pine needles all over the roof. I parked the car, stretched my legs, and stood still for a moment just listening. The quiet was deep. No humming traffic, no chatter, not even a plane overhead. Just wind moving through trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I unlocked the door, went inside, and took a look around. It smelled like dry wood and dust. There was a bed in the corner, a small kitchen with a propane stove, shelves with canned food, a table with 2 chairs and a fireplace. Nothing fancy, just enough. I unpacked my things, made the bed, checked the windows and doors, and walked around outside to get a sense of the area. There was a clearing behind the cabin with some stumps and old logs, probably from trees that had been cut down years ago. Beyond that, just endless trees in every direction. Felt good. Empty. Still, that first day was peaceful. I read, cooked some canned beans, and sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the trees. The air got cold fast. By nightfall, the temperature dropped, and I made a small fire inside using some dry logs stacked by the wall. The crackling would made the whole place feel warmer, safer even. I turned off the solar light and just sat there for a while with the firelight flickering against the walls. I slept fine that night, better than I had in weeks. The next few days went by slow, and that was exactly what I wanted. I'd wake up with the sun, drink coffee on the porch, go for small hikes through the forest trails behind the cabin, and come back by late afternoon. I found a small stream not far off and used it to wash up sometimes. I never wandered too far, though. I didn't want to get lost. I kept a compass on me and made sure I could always trace my way back by marking trees with small cuts in the bark. There was no one out there, no houses, no campsites, nothing. But on the 4th night, something changed. I was sitting inside after dinner, reading a book near the fire. The air had gone still outside. No wind, no rustling trees, no distant bird calls. It felt heavier somehow. I didn't think much of it until I heard a sharp, snapping sound from the woods behind the cabin, like a branch breaking, not a small one either. It sounded heavy, thick, like it took some weight to snap it. I froze, listening. Nothing followed, just silence. I got up slowly and stepped toward the back window, which looked out into the dark woods. Couldn't see much, just shadows. I figured maybe a deer had stepped wrong, or maybe a dead branch fell. That's all. But the next morning, I found footprints near the back clearing. Not animal tracks, these were boot prints. Not mine either. I checked the pattern and compared it to my own. These were deeper, wider, and pointed toward the cabin before turning back the way they came. I felt this tightness in my stomach as I followed them for a few feet. They led from the woods to the back of the cabin, stopped about 15 feet from the wall, then turned and went back. The prints weren't there the day before, that I was sure of. It had rained briefly 2 nights before, and the soft dirt still held the shape clearly. These were fresh. I stood there for a while, just staring into the woods where the prints disappeared. I didn't like it. For the first time since I got there, I felt uneasy. Someone had come through those woods during the night. They didn't knock, didn't make themselves known, just walked up close to the cabin and left. I couldn't think of a good reason why anyone would do that out here unless they were lost. But if they were lost, why not ask for help? Why sneak around at night? I kept thinking maybe it was a hunter, but there were no signs posted around saying hunting was allowed in this area. And if someone was out here for hunting, why get so close to the cabin without saying anything? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I checked the windows and doors again, made sure everything locked properly, and brought a piece of firewood inside to keep near the bed just in case. I kept the knife under the pillow that night. I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up, listening for sounds. There was nothing, not even the wind. Just thick, complete silence. The following morning, I walked the perimeter around the cabin. No new prints. Nothing disturbed. I tried to shake it off and go about the day like usual, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. That tight, prickling feeling on the back of your neck, like someone's eyes are locked on you. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking over my shoulder, walking back to the cabin more than once just to make sure no one was following. That afternoon, I heard another branch snap, this time closer. I looked out again, and of course, nothing. The trees just stood there like always. That night, just after midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard soft crunching sounds. Footsteps. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, eyes wide, listening. They were slow and deliberate, moving across the gravel path in front of the porch. Then they stopped. For a full minute, there was nothing. Then soft tapping. Not loud, barely audible. Like someone running their fingers down the wall of the cabin, just brushing against it. I sat up slowly, held the knife, and didn't move. I kept staring at the door, waiting for the knob to turn, for something to knock, anything. But nothing happened. After about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped. I waited another hour before I dared to even lie down again. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was done pretending everything was fine. I packed my stuff quickly, stuffed everything into the car, and decided I'd leave early. I still had 4 days left, but I didn't care. Something felt wrong. I didn't want to find out what it was. I tried turning the ignition. Nothing. The car was dead. The lights didn't come on, the engine didn't turn, not even a click. I checked under the hood. Battery terminals were connected fine. No damage I could see. I walked around the car, looking for signs of tampering. That's when I saw them again. Prints. This time circling the car. Boot prints in the dirt. They went around the car twice, then off into the trees. Someone had come again during the night, closer this time. Maybe they messed with the car. Maybe they were waiting for me to come out and panic. I stood there frozen, holding the knife in one hand, staring into the woods. Then I heard it. A sound I hadn't heard in days. A long, slow whistle. Not a bird, not a breeze. A human whistle, like someone trying to get attention or signal something. It came from the trees behind the cabin, just faint enough to make me question if I heard it right. But I know I had. I didn't wait. I ran inside, locked the door, and pulled the curtains shut. I pushed the table against the door and moved the wood stove in front of the back window. I stayed like that the entire day. No food, no water, just sitting with the knife, trying to stay calm. The whistle never came again. No footsteps, nothing. But that was worse. The quiet now felt like it was hiding something. I knew someone was out there, and I didn't know what they wanted. That night, I heard movement again, but not outside, inside. A soft creak came from the back of the cabin, near the fireplace. My chest tightened. I stood up, slowly, holding the knife, and stepped toward the sound. Came again, another soft creak. I looked toward the small closet door beside the firewood stack. It was I needed to get away. I'd been working from home for nearly 2 years straight, stuck in my small apartment in the city, and the noise, the emails, the calls, the lights, it all just built up to a point where I couldn't think straight anymore. I couldn't sleep without hearing traffic or a siren in the distance. It was like my body forgot what quiet felt like. So I decided to rent a cabin for a week. Just me, nature, and quiet. I found this place on a listing website. It was a small wooden cabin, 2 hours from where I lived, way up north near a national forest. The pictures made it look peaceful. Big trees, a fire pit, a tiny porch with a single rocking chair, and a creek that ran just a short walk behind the property. The description said there was no cell signal, which honestly was what sold it for me. I wanted to be unreachable. I left on a Sunday morning. The drive up was mostly empty highway, followed by long winding roads through thick pine woods. I stopped at a gas station near a small town called Barrows Point to stock up on snacks, water, and a few groceries, since the listing had warned that the cabin was about an hour away from the nearest store. The last 30 minutes of the drive were rough, gravel road, no signs, just the GPS trying to guide me through bumpy dirt paths with tree branches scraping the sides of my car. I was honestly worried I'd taken a wrong turn, but after crawling along for a while, I saw the cabin come into view. It was nestled at the edge of a clearing, surrounded on all sides by trees that stood so tall and close together that the sky felt small. It looked just like the pictures. A single room with a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen setup, a twin bed with flannel sheets, and a small bathroom that thankfully had running water from a nearby well. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, no radio, not even a clock on the wall. I loved it. That first day was calm. I unpacked my stuff, put food in the small fridge, and sat on the porch with a cold drink in my hand. The air smelled like pine and dirt, and I could hear birds, the wind rustling through the trees, and nothing else. No engines, no horns, no shouting neighbors. Just silence. I felt like my brain was finally starting to slow down. I went to bed early that night, just after dark, and slept like I hadn't in months. The kind of deep, dreamless sleep that leaves you feeling heavier when you wake up. When morning came, I made coffee and walked the short trail behind the cabin that led to the creek. It was a quiet, narrow stream that curved through the woods, with smooth rocks on either side where I sat and just listened to the water. By the third day, I'd fully settled in. I kept a small notepad where I wrote about things I saw, bird types I didn't recognize, how cold the air got at night, how quiet everything stayed even at midday. There were no neighbors nearby, no signs of other people. It was just me. But something changed on the fourth night. I went to bed a little after 10. I remember because I had my watch on the nightstand and had glanced at it before turning off the lamp. I slept with the window open a crack because the inside of the cabin would get stuffy at night. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why, just one of those moments where your eyes pop open and something feels off. It was dark inside the cabin. No lights, no sound, just the faint creaking of the trees outside. I sat up and listened. Then I heard it, a crunching sound, like leaves or dry twigs snapping underfoot. It was faint but close, like maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the cabin. I froze. The cabin didn't have curtains. The windows were bare, and though it was dark, the moon was full, and a little light poured in. I didn't move. I just listened. The crunching sound happened again. Slow, careful steps, too heavy for a deer or any small animal. It was someone walking. I leaned slowly toward the window, just enough to look out without being seen. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the thump in my ears. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadow. But then I spotted it. A shape, person, standing maybe 20 feet from the cabin. Not moving, just standing there. I couldn't make out a face or even much detail, but the shape was clearly human. Not hunched like a bear, not quick like a coyote. It was a person, standing behind a thin tree, facing the cabin. Not doing anything, just standing. I stayed completely still for what felt like forever. My legs started to cramp from staying crouched like that. I watched the figure until I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the window slowly, crawled to the far side of the room where I kept my bag, and pulled out the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping kindling. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, hatchet in my hand, eyes on the window. I kept glancing out, but the figure was gone. Maybe 10 minutes after I first saw them, they had vanished. But I never heard them walk away. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside cautiously, looking for footprints or any sign that someone had been near the cabin. I checked the clearing, the trees, even the small trail toward the creek. Nothing. No broken branches, no shoe prints, no sign at all. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a dream. That morning, I packed up some of my things and drove back down the gravel road until I got a couple bars of service. I called the number the cabin owner had listed, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message saying I thought someone had been on the property. Then I waited a few minutes, got no call back, and decided to head back. I could have left, but part of me didn't want to give up the quiet I'd come all this way to find. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter who wandered too close, or someone hiking through the woods. Weird, sure, but not impossible. I stayed another night. That was a mistake. That second night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up with the lights off, sitting in the corner where I had a view of both windows and the front door. I didn't hear anything until almost 3 a.m. Then the doorknob jiggled. It was soft, quiet, but I heard it. A slow, steady rattle, like someone testing it gently. My whole body tensed up. I gripped the hatchet tighter and held my breath. After a few seconds, it stopped. Silence again. I crept toward the window, low and careful. I peeked out and saw the same shape again. This time, a little closer. Still not moving fast, still not talking, just standing there, watching. I ducked back down and waited. I stayed that way until sunrise. When the light came, I opened the door and checked outside. Again, no footprints. But this time, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the far side of the porch, just under the window, someone had left something. It was a small stack of rocks, about 6 or 7 flat stones, carefully balanced. On top of the stack was a dead bird. Some kind of sparrow, its wings spread, eyes wide open, frozen stiff. There was no blood, no damage, just dead. I stared at it for a long time. Then I kicked the rocks over, threw the bird into the woods, and went inside to pack. I didn't care how far I had to drive. I was done. I loaded my car in record time. I barely even locked the cabin behind me. The forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt like it was pressing in on me, watching me. I started the car and drove. My tires skidded a little on the gravel, but I didn't slow down. About a mile down the road, I saw something in the middle of the path. A large branch, thick, too big to run over. It wasn't there the day before. I stopped the car and got out, hatchet still in the passenger seat. The air was still, too still. I looked around carefully, heart racing, and dragged the branch to the side. It was heavier than it looked, almost like someone had purposely placed it there. I got back into the car and kept going. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I called the cabin owner again from the gas station at Barrows Point. This time, someone picked up. A woman, maybe mid-50s, from the sound of it. I told her what happened. She got quiet. Then she sighed. "You're not the first," she said. I waited, but she didn't explain. I asked what she meant, but she just said the cabin had been broken into once before, a long time ago, and they'd put up signs warning hikers not to go near private property. But she never mentioned anything about a man watching the cabin. I didn't press. I just told her I was done and I'd left the keys where she asked. She said fine, and that was it. That night, back in my apartment, the city noise didn't bother me. The sirens, the shouting, the traffic, I welcomed it. Felt like people were around, like I wasn't alone. A week later, I got a small package in the mail. No return address, just my name. Inside was a single flat stone, and on the back of it, scratched into the surface, was one word: